Okay, good afternoon. Apologies for no videos the last couple of days. I've been a bit under the weather. I've been a bit ill the last few days, with like a spring cold, like bit of a head cold. So I haven't been at work. I got sent home from work. I've had 2 days off, sick, although I'm going back tomorrow. Whether I should be or not, another thing, but I'm feeling a bit better. But big news. Liverpool are still on course for the quadruple. Whether they actually win 4 trophies or not is another thing. The Premier League's still very tight. They've obviously got to overcome Chelsea in the FA Cup final in a few days' time. Um, Obviously, they already have the League Cup, and of course now the Champions League final. They beat Villarreal. They're through. Um, Whoever they face in that final, be it Real Madrid or Man City, um, it's it's going to be, you know, a quite a challenge to win all 4 competitions they're aiming, you know, to win. But they're still in with a chance of winning 4 pieces of silverware this season. Now that would be a fantastic achievement considering where they were in the league around Christmas. They've closed that gap on Man City significantly. So that is going to be some achievement. Should they be able to not only win the league title, but to win the FA Cup and the Champions League as well, on top of the League Cup they've already run. That's going to be some some season, quite frankly. But there's no denying how consistent and how good they've been over a significant period of time. Other news with Manchester United. Um, Pogba is off contract. So is Juan Mata, and of course Matic is leaving. So they're 3 of the names on the way out. Ranić's been highly critical of his time in charge, saying obviously the goal was Champions League qualification, which is looking highly unlikely at this point. So that's quite interesting. Burnley are in trouble if they get relegated because of their leverage takeover by ALK, which is sort of similar to the Glazier takeover of Manchester United. So they need to stay up in order to avoid financial meltdown. Bloody cold. But yes, it's hotting up in the Premier League. I personally think Everton are the club to go down. Personally. Now, Leeds are in trouble as well, but Everton's away record is shocking. Abramovich's U-turn. What's Abramovich done now? Let's have a look at Roman Abramovich. Apologies for my sniffling. I've got a bit of a head cold. Oh, what's my phone doing? Right. No. I'm going to cooperate. Roman Abramovich. What's his U-turn in regards to? Oh, yeah, it's to do with his loan, isn't it? Well, this the problem is if it wasn't for Abramovich, the amount of debt the club had would have led them into administration and points deduction anyway. And the club, Chelsea fans go, "Oh, but he brought us success." The club was badly run for a long time. Even with Abramovich's money, it was still not a profitable venture. Chelsea fans refused to hear that for the best part of 2 decades. The club wasn't actually making any money. Um, I think this is pressure tactics to for whatever reason. Of course, sanctions are sanctions, so he won't be getting any money. Um, they've got 25 days in order to complete the takeover. God knows what happens to Chelsea. The, the Chelsea situation is unique, but it's only unique in the sense that the owner has been sanctioned by a sovereign government. Um, it's not unique in the sense that, apart from all the trophies that Chelsea have had and all the success, um, the club was not run in a financially viable way. And Man City will find this out at some point. Newcastle, I found it out under Mike Ashley, but some of these super wealthy clubs where they've got infinite wealth behind the owner, when the owner gets bored or for whatever reason decides to move on, in Chelsea's case with Abramovich being sanctioned uh, by governments around the world because he's a Russian individual, he'd been interested in selling the club for a couple of years. So regardless of the fact that as the owner he was being sanctioned anyway, um, he had always stated since I think around 2018, 2019 that he would be happy to sell the club if the right ownership group was to come along. And it wouldn't have surprised me if some of these consortium bids that are now on the table to buy the club, had they come along at the right time before COVID to purchase the club, he would have been more than happy to accept the purchase and accept the bid. So uh, the situation with Chelsea, yes, I think has been accelerated by the sanctions, but the debt was still there, and the fact the club didn't make any money. The only season where Chelsea didn't make any money, well, actually made some money, is when they actually had the transfer embargo, and they only made a small profit, and we're talking a couple of million. So, in all regards, Chelsea was not financially well run. It was not financially viable. In fact, Chelsea hasn't been financially viable since about 1970. Chelsea has had money issues and structural problems for 30, 40 years. Um, the fact he wants his debt repaid, again, this is speculated. This is not actual fact because you know what the media is like with actually publishing the facts. Let's have a quick read on the article. Let's see. Well, it's been reported on multiple news outlets, so there has to be some vein of truth to the statement. Um, so Sky Sports, Chelsea selling doubt as Roman Abramovich attempts to restructure his deal to regain some debt. Telegraph, same. Talk Sport, which is basically Sky, is the same as the Sky one. Daily Mail. Well, the Daily Mail is claiming they risk Premier League expulsion. They won't get expelled. They'll just have a massive points deduction at the start of next season. Um, uh, the interesting thing, and what is it's yeah, it's been well. Look, what's this risk of Premier League expulsion? It's difficult because they don't want him to get the money from the sale over the bad PR the government and Premier League get. I hope the Premier League gets bad PR. Um, Even before, look, Chelsea's facing its biggest crisis since the 1987 Save the Bridge campaign. The club was already broke before then. Roman Abramovich reportedly wants 1.6 billion loan repaid to agree to a sale. Um, it said he fears the loan cannot be written off due to UK government sanctions. Um, if they're not granted a new operating license by June 8th, they will not re-enter the Premier League. Um, I think this is more a play by Abramovich to get concessions on other or some other of his financial assets. The club is already basically bust anyway. The reason why it had a loan from Abramovich of the tune to 1.5 to 1.6 billion, depending on the source, is it wasn't making any money. It never has. The club hasn't made any money since the 70s. The club has been in financial crisis for years. The fact that the owner is exceptionally wealthy is irrelevant. The club itself is broke. Um, the club has almost gone bust in the 80s and the 90s. When Ken Bates agreed the sale of the club to Abramovich, the club was basically out of cash. In the 90s, when Vialli and Dennis Wise and such were playing there, um, how they were able to afford those transfers of players is a head scratcher because, again, the club was basically broke. And there's a reason why, over the years of Abramovich being the owner, he's lent the club money. Work that one out. Um, the club has never made enough money to sustain itself, and the people go, "Oh, but you need supersized stadiums to compete financially." No, you don't. You need to have a stable financial model, which a lot of clubs don't have, because it's the win now mentality, and they don't plan for the future, and they don't save up for a rainy day. So Chelsea were spending money they didn't have. Um, I don't give a I don't give a toss if the club goes bust. If I'm being honest, I really don't care if the club goes bust. Chelsea is the issues with Chelsea highlights the problems with football. Regardless of the fact that the owner is facing economic sanctions because of his nationality and the government he's linked to and all that. Had Abramovich sold the club off before COVID and before the sanctions against Russia, he would still expect to be paid his loan back, which the club cannot afford as a standalone entity. The club has never made a profit under Abramovich apart from one season, and that one season um, was when they had the transfer embargo and they couldn't spend money in the transfer market. Tells you all we need to know. The club has never been a profitable entity. Um, a lot of clubs are running the same way, where it's the win now mentality, and they spend more than they have in financial reserves. They spend more than what their income is. Um, no, no. Well, look, we're run by the Venkies, and our debt is similar. Our debt is more than we bring in. We're in breach of the 135% rule, and if the EFL and the FA is to properly enforce their rules, we would be in the same position as Chelsea. It's weakness of governance which allows unscrupulous owners, and you're a Birmingham City fan, and they've been run badly. Uh, does anyone? No club deserves to go bust. No club's too big to get relegated. I remember them saying that about Leeds United and Nottingham Forest back in the late 90s and early 2000s. No, problem is the weak governance has led to this situation over many years. If I hate getting over colds and flu. Blackburn is in the same situation as Chelsea. So are Burnley, Man United. Big clubs, small clubs. I mean, look, Bury's gone out of business. The governing bodies of football have failed over a significant period of time in enforcing their rules properly. The rules are in place, they're just not properly enforced. Now, as a Blackburn fan, I want the Venkies gone. Unfortunately, if they were to sell the club on, any new owner would have to restructure that debt and pay the idiots back all the debt they got us into, and pay the creditors. So it doesn't matter who owns my football club, that debt needs to be repaid. Same with Chelsea. Now, Abramovich is not the only creditor Chelsea Football Club owes money to. He's just their biggest creditor, but there's loads of smaller creditors that Chelsea owe money to over, again, a lengthy period of time. They No club deserves to go bust. Well, in that case, no business deserves to go bust. Oh wait, yes they do if they run badly. Sorry, it's called capitalism. Um, Woolworths went out of business. They'll shockingly run as a company. Um, what other companies have gone bust that I remember as a kid? There's been loads. I think was it Cost Cutter? They're gone. One of the Poundland or Pound Worlds is gone. Safeway got bought out by Co-op because it was badly run. Morrison's bought another chunk of it. Summerfield's went out of business. We're talking big supermarkets here. They're gone. Car companies have gone bust like TVR because they weren't well run. Norton Motorcycles, the boss was nicking all the money. No club deserves to go bust. If they're badly run, they do, actually. Do I feel sorry for the fans? Absolutely. Do I have any sympathy for football? No. No. I think the sympathy's run out. I'm sorry if I've become a bit of a cynic, but I think the footballing authorities have failed in their remit to protect the integrity of the sport. They have failed catastrophically, and it's not just a failure that's happened in recent years. This has been happening for a very, very long time. And we are where we are in regards to the situation with Chelsea, with Everton. Burnley are in serious trouble if they get relegated. The Glazers of Man United is just a bigger version of Burnley with a leveraged buyout. So it's other people's money that they bought the club with, and basically you saddle the club with debt. The footballing authorities allowed these takeovers to take place. They allowed these unsustainable and quite frankly non-economical business models to take place, and fans are complaining when ticket prices are so high and merchandise prices are so high, and yet they're still wondering how these clubs are losing money. Look at the size of the TV deals, both domestic and overseas, for the Premier League. Where has the money gone? Barcelona should be the most profitable, one of the most profitable sporting brands globally. It should be making money hand over fist. Why is it 1.3 billion euros in debt? Where has the money gone? And suddenly, out of nowhere, the football clubs and the footballing authorities can't answer that question. Where's the money gone? Can't answer it. They do not have a straight answer for a simple question. Where's all the money gone? Where's the investment? Where's the money gone? And we do know that club owners and football clubs were cooking the books going into COVID. Oh no, they haven't. But as I said, the situation, not just with English football, but with football in general, has been going on for the best part of 30 years. Since the end of the Soviet bloc, basically the Eastern Bloc, with Europe reunited politically, and then all the money surging to Western Europe and all the talent going to the 5-6 leagues in Western Europe. But the question is, and this is where football cannot answer the question, is where's all the money gone? They've got these bumper TV deals, these massive sponsorship deals, these obscene transfers and player wages. But that still does not tell us where all the money's gone. They cannot answer that. Yes, as businesses, they've got to pay tax, but they still, you could say, factor in taxes, player wages, staff wages, stadium rebuilds, new stadium builds, refurbishments to training. You can factor in your standard expenditure, which is your salaries, and then your transfer spending, which is contractual is ironically classed as contractual fees, ironically. Contractual compensation fees, that's the term. And then your day-to-day maintenance of club stadiums, training grounds, other club facilities. But that still does not factor in the amount of money that's disappeared. Portsmouth is the case in question, a very good case in question, where the exact amount of money they won in prize money, winning the FA Cup and entering Europe that season, is the exact amount of money that sort of disappeared from the books in a 12-month period into Milan Man Richard's bank account. Oh, and Harry Redknapp's dog's bank account as well. It's exactly the same amount of money that mysteriously vanished from the club accounts. We do know that football clubs were cooking the books when they were telling us back in 2016, 2017, for example, that season, they could let us all in for free or for less than £10. £10 to nothing. So less than a tenner, they could let all the fans in, and it wouldn't impact them being profitable. Fast forward 3 years, we're having to furlough staff, we can't afford our costs and overheads. But hang on a second, 3 years ago you're saying you can let us all in for nothing, and now you're saying, "No, we need fans in attendance." They were clearly cooking the books for whatever reason. Um, but yes, the footballing authorities have failed with Derby County. They failed currently with Chelsea. Everton could be the next big one. There's a whole host of clubs in the lower divisions. Bolton nearly went out of business alongside Bury in 2019. So yes, there are definitely um, things to be said about the situation, and Bury went 12 months before Macclesfield, so you know there's definitely a conversation to be had about English football. But then you go north of the border to Rangers and Gretna and Dunfermline having money issues, and Celtic in their past. It's not just a one nation specific problem. It's football in Europe and South America's problem because the MLS is not hampered by this situation for some reason because they operate under a salary cap. It's a franchise based model. Whereas for some reason, clubs in Europe and South America, it's the club model, promotion relegation, the TV deal's worth more money, there's more season ticket holders, more fans, more merchandise sales. There's a lot more money in the European, South American game than in the US and Canada. It's first up. But there's got to be the question asked, where has all this money gone? Why are clubs in massive financial distress? Surely these entities should have been so well insulated for the most part, because there's always going to be a couple of have-nots when it comes to the big scheme of things. So there's a finite number of fans of money. But why is it then that some of the biggest clubs in the global game are bankrupt? You know, why is it then that for many, many years the governing bodies, both domestically within Europe and South America and then at FIFA level, have been turning a blind eye to the reckless mismanagement on an industrial scale? Why have they turned a blind eye to this situation? And what has it achieved? I would argue it's led to massive problems, and UEFA have been forced to speed up their process of changing the financial rules in as a response to COVID. We know Serafin when he was appointed as the new UEFA chairman. He came one of the first statements he gave, one of the first media conferences he gave. He said financial fair play doesn't work. We need to replace it. So he'd already set out his stall saying the systems we have in place are broken. And this is why I think Alexander Serafin is the guy to take the way forward. He's not regularly in the headlines like Platini was. He even stated after even before the last Euros, which was cross-continental, pan-European, because it was meant to be the 60th anniversary of the first Euros. We're never doing this again. It was a bad idea. While it was utopian in thought, bad idea. We're not doing it. This is why I think Alexander Serafin is the right guy to take the way forward. Now, we can all agree or disagree on the reformatting of the Champions League. The reformatting of the Champions League because the next TV rights deal is up. And a lot of fans aren't in favour of it. And that's in the backdrop of the European Super League. And we can argue, did he deal with the European Super League effectively? Ineffectively? The fact it was allowed to get so far? He stared them down and he won. Now, the fact that Real Madrid, Barcelona and Juventus still don't want to give up, another thing. But if Chelsea get thrown out of the Premier League, I think that would start putting a line in the sand saying you cannot tell us how to run our game. You play by our rules or you're out. And if Chelsea don't get that operating licence within just over a month's time, they're done. Now, I know a lot of Chelsea fans, so that will be interesting. It'll be interesting to see if the sale goes through. It'll be interesting because that will make Abramovich a charlatan. All the statements he's given over many years says he loves the club. Blah, blah, blah. Suddenly he's like, no, I'm going to destroy it. We will see what happens with Chelsea. I mean, other clubs, maybe smaller clubs like a Bury or a Macclesfield, have been shafted by the FA and the Football League. In this case, it's the Premier League and the FA. But Derby County are in a mess, may not survive the summer if their sale doesn't go through. Obviously, Rangers have had their issues in the last decade, had to basically reform themselves. Gretna have gone out of business. So it's not just an English football problem, but I understand. But clubs with a smaller imprint have had to reform. I mean, look at Italian football; it happens all the time. The reason why Chelsea's making such a big news story is the former owner is being one of those individuals being sanctioned by a sovereign government. But the same principle applies. They were never financially viable. They never made any money. And Chelsea fans cannot accept this fact. The fact that Abramovich lent the club 1.5 billion in order to prop them up on top of his initial purchase tells you all you need to know about the financial state of that football club and how that football club was run over 20 years or 18 years. You know, it tells you all you need to know about the mismanagement and the mess that Chelsea Football Club. And this is why I don't think Man City are financially viable either, because the owners have got an infinite pot of cash, but there will come a point where, for whatever reason, the Sheikh Mansour and that ownership group either need fresh investment to cover their losses from outside sources, and this will also happen to Newcastle. Sorry to say, will also happen to Newcastle at some point. Now, the Public Investment Fund only owns 70% Newcastle. The other 30% is split between the Reuben brothers and Amanda Staveley. But there will come a point where they will seek extra investment from other interested parties to assist with the financial goings on at their football club, at your football club. And with what we've seen with Chelsea, I wouldn't be surprised if none of these clubs are financially viable. Even with UEFA's new spending rules, the current financial fair play rules, the current directors' test, they're not being properly enforced. The 135% loss over profit rule is not being properly enforced because surveys have been done, people have obtained freedom of information requests, they've broken down the numbers. 60 to 70% of the football clubs in the Football League, including the Premier League, are in breach of one, if not all, the criteria of the spending over income. Look, if Chelsea do get thrown out of the Premier League, that means a lot of non-playing staff and players will be out of a job. Now we can go, limited crocodile tears for the millionaire football players. But that also has a knock-on impact for the women's game, of which Chelsea are world leaders, and equality development, an impact economically in West London because you've got from next season 2 West London rivals, which will have mega ticket sales in Brentford and Fulham. They're going to be sellout games that Brentford and Fulham would have factored in with their ticket pricing, their match day programs, the pre-match entertainment, It's like when Bury went out of business, Accrington Stanley's only said that's cost us £250,000 home and away, and that's in League One. You factor that up to a Premier League club going out of business, that's multiple millions of pounds in lost revenue from the TV companies through ticket sales on the day and merchandise sales on the day. So, so when Bury went out of business 3 years ago, just under 3 years ago, sorry, Accrington Stanley's owner approximated on lost earnings. They predicted lost earnings was £250,000 for both games home and away that season. Now you fast out, as I say, to Premier League level, and Accrington Stanley is one of the smallest stadiums in the Football League with their home ground. They operate on the smallest budgets. £250,000 to Accrington Stanley and lost their is equivalent to paying half the playing squad for a season. And I'm not joking. That is a massive hit for Accrington Stanley. You factor that in for a club the size of Chelsea with fan base, and then talk about their London rivals in Fulham and Brentford, for example, who would be, making bumper profits on those home and away games. Big money for all clubs concerned. It's not going to be £250,000 in lost revenue. That's going to be several million minimum in lost revenue, home and away. How much is up to the ticket pricing of both clubs, and the merchandise sales and programme sales, food and drink. Then you factor in the lost revenue in the surrounding areas, as in retail, bars and restaurants, transport. It has a knock-on effect, not only for Fulham and Brentford, but the surrounding area around Chelsea and every other football club in the Premier League. But then you've got to factor in, at the moment, they're going to qualify for Champions League qualification. And then you've got to factor in FA Cup and League Cup games. That's a lot of lost revenue for local economies and the football clubs that Chelsea will be facing next season. And if the government do decide to help, then Bury fans, Macclesfield fans, there will be a sort of us and them mentality. And then there is, yes, Bury. I mean, there's two. There's the Phoenix Club Bury, and then there's the actual people who bought the stadium and bought the rights to Bury Football Club. The fact that happened should never have happened. And that, again, comes down to the director's test not being properly enforced. And it's also coming back to not auditing clubs, not being stricter on the rules governing spending within football clubs. And the system basically being broken because weak enforcement for a very long time. And if Chelsea do get a system, Bury and Macclesfield fans can quite rightly go, well, it's one rule for the media darlings of the top leagues. It's another rule for those struggling at the lower levels who've been screwed by the Premier League for 3 decades because the money hasn't filtered down like they claimed it had. Bearing in mind, you honestly, if anyone can set up a sporting club and start from the bottom level. It could be a Sunday league club, a pub team. Start a club from any level. It doesn't matter if it's the Phoenix Club or not. Anyone can start a sports club. It doesn't matter what sport it is. And then you just work your way through the levels of the pyramid as far as your club can go up the pyramid to a point. And then you need to find more permanent facilities in which to play your home games. And set up the structures of your club. Yeah, it could be. There were 2 Bury football clubs basically, but sort of similar. I would argue, but at the same time, you can quite easily they can go their divergent paths and rename themselves. And it's the same with FC United of Manchester. They were set up in protest at the Glazers' takeover of Manchester United. And they're doing quite well for themselves in their existence. Again, it's complex, but in theory, you can as long as you have facilities to play at, you can set up a football club, a cricket club, a rugby club. You can set up any sports club you want. And as long as you can go up the sporting pyramid as far as your facilities allow you before you have to get a more sizable stadium to play in or home ground to play at, and more permanent facilities rather than just a park, like Hackney Marshes back in the day, then so be it. But yeah, anyone can set up a club in a community. I mean, there's a cricket club up the road from me. There's a football club down the road from me. There's a rugby club down the road from me. None of them are playing at the top level, but they're in the sporting pyramids of those various sports up to the level they can play at. Yeah, they could merge. Club mergers have happened before, and they could merge. That's something that could happen. Is they could merge together and pool their resources, which would probably be a better thing than being the two separate sporting entities. Um, I really love having a head cold. It's lovely. I've been ill for 2 days. Horrible. No, they could. They can quite easily merge the two clubs together as long as they go through the correct process. And the FA sign off on it. They can merge their two entities together. It's been done before. Um, and the thing is, the Berry name is going to resurface. It's going to survive. It's not completely, gone to rack and ruin. But this is where the EFL, and the FA have faced a lot of criticism for how they handled that situation and with how they've handled the Bolton Wanderers situation, which was going at the same time. The difference being Bolton had played games that Berry hadn't. If Berry had played a game, they would have been allowed to survive because then it does ultimately impact the season. In regards to um, what's happening at Derby County, same thing. They'll be allowed to finish this season. Next season, they have to be compliant by a certain date, much like Chelsea. Otherwise, they risk being thrown out of the Football League. So Chelsea and Derby are in the same situation for different reasons, admittedly, but overall the same premise of chronic financial mismanagement for a lengthy period of time with a lot of debt. Regardless of the reasons why they're in the situation, one of the same parallels is financial mismanagement and debt. So Derby and Chelsea, for different reasons, are in the same situation where they have a limited time in order to find a buyer, complete said takeover, and be financially compliant by a certain date in order to get their operating license to continue next season. And if Derby, for example, don't get the assistance and Chelsea do, then there's going to be uproar. If Chelsea get an extension to their special operating license and Derby don't, there'll be an uproar. Basically, I'm surprised it's taken this long for clubs to feel the effects of COVID. I honestly felt more clubs would go out of business in the last 2 years than has actually occurred. You think the Phoenix Club will continue? It may well do. It may well do. There's no guarantee they'll decide to merge and pool their resources with the other Bury Football Club. They're not obliged to do so. And it's up to their members and their boards to decide what they feel is best for their club. It's like when two companies merge together, there will be board meetings and board votes and employee votes on what necessarily will be the best course of action. Do we merge with this competitor or do we continue as separate? So whatever decision is taken has to be respected, but I think at some point they'll probably merge and pull their resources together, which would be at the benefit of Bury Football Club, quite frankly. In regards to the Derby and Chelsea situations, the FA, Football League and the Premier League are under a spotlight now. And as I said, I'm really surprised that Macclesfield is the only club since the COVID pandemic hit to go out of business. Obviously, Bury, 4 months before COVID, 4 or 5 months before COVID was a thing, went out of business. But I'm surprised only one football club in the UK has gone out of business since the beginning of the middle of March 2020. So in the last 2 years, only one club has fallen on its sword. I am surprised only one has done so. I know two more are now in grave peril of ending up the same way. It just so happens they're bigger names in the game. Derby's a mid-sized club with a good history. They've been league champions before. They've been in the top division before, obviously. And of course, Chelsea won all the trophies under Abramovich. So they're bigger fish in a very small pond. The fact that, as I say, only Macclesfield in the last 2 years has gone under is amazing, in my opinion, considering the losses that have been incurred. Well, again, it tells you that whoever takes on this entity has got to deal with some real poor structures that for the best part of 20 years have been allowed to manifest where they're not making any money. So whoever takes on this club is going to be having to deal with the fact that the club isn't profitable with the way it's been run. Now, if they decide to make changes to how that club is run, we'll have to see how that manifests itself in regards to, does it impact the on-field situation with performances and its compete level and attracting talent. It may force Chelsea to finally start using their youth talent. Who knew? Finally reaping the rewards of their youth system they so claim is so vaunted. Who would have thought? But no, jokes aside and sarcasm aside, the debt is a problem. But it's the same for Derby County as a football club with debt looking for a buyer. And depending on what sources you read, some owners in the Football League and the Premier League are considering selling up, and a lot of the clubs in the top 92 have a lot of debt. There's very few clubs that are in the black. Basically, they're in the red. A lot of them operate at a operating loss or barely break even. And the pandemic has exposed a lot of the financial mismanagement that we see in today's game. Literally, the last 2 years has massively exposed the chronic mismanagement and the weak governance. Now, yes, the situation with Chelsea is going to be the situation of structuring and paying off the debt. Now, who does the debt get paid to? Because Abramovich is under sanctions, and therefore his accounts are frozen. Who takes on that debt? Does the debt get wiped clean? Irregardless, it is posing a problem. I can't see the Premier League or the government wanting this takeover to fail. But if they start fiddling further, I say fiddling as the word, manipulating the deal to ensure Chelsea doesn't get thrown out the league, but they don't assist Derby in any way, it leads to problems. And look what we've seen with Bury and Macclesfield. There will be a lot of questions asked about the integrity of the system if there is outside interference manipulating the Chelsea situation to ensure the club doesn't fail. And I said before, no club is destined not to fail. At some point, a club will get relegated. No club is too big to go down. If this was the real world, so the other 95% of what goes on, businesses go bust all the time. I think the biggest collapse of a business I can think of in the UK, at least, that I remember, partly because my dad was working in the supply chain as Rover MG back in 2004, and to a certain extent TBR. Two car companies going out of business in the last 20 years. You got Woolworths as well in retail. So I remember and I have seen businesses go bust. Football clubs are now more business than club, and it's gone full circle. What I think happens with Chelsea is I think a deal is done in some way, shape, or form. Uh, they were already on a very tight time frame to get the deal done. Um, they've only got 25 days to, until their current license runs out, and that's to do with the current football season. And they've then after that got 8 days in which to further. So they've got 25, 33 days basically to complete the process. Bearing in mind, Newcastle United took the best part of 18 months um, with, you know, legal roadblocks put in place, vetoes by clubs. So Newcastle United took 18 months. Chelsea, either corners are going to have to be cut in the process, or they're going to have to streamline it and simplify the contracts massively. So whether this is the well thought out takeover deal or not is going to be exceptionally interesting. That is a lot of filthy fluff. Yep, going to need to do some back. So the Chelsea situation um, is very interesting because it is sort of new. Yeah, ITV Sport, ITV Digital, yes. If we're going back 20 odd years, 18, 20 years, yes. And so same as Setanta, the baby version. That had an impact that's still being, I would say, sort of felt today actually, all these years later. Um, you could argue the situation with ITV's attempt at a 24-hour sports network um, did massive harm to the ITV company. It almost brought ITV to bankruptcy, destroyed its share price completely. Um, and it's taken many, many years for ITV to start clawing itself out of the financial mess that ITV Digital and what was ITV Sport as its sports arm going tits up caused the broadcaster. Um, and then you fast forward 8, 9 years to Satanta's collapse. Um, that had a knock-on effect, obviously, predominantly for Scottish football, but the lower leagues in England as well took a massive hit. And that was a TV company overextending itself. It was a foreign-owned TV company, and so questions were asked about Ofcom and the BBC granting licenses for overseas broadcasters. And those questions haven't fully gone away all these years later. There's still a lingering resentment to how both ITV Digital and Satanta's collapses were dealt with. The impacts. Oh, no, absolutely. I mean, whether you're a basketball fan or not, the fact that it was so reliant on, I can't remember who was it, ITV or Setanta, but it was very reliant on one of them, and was too reliant. And this is where if Sky goes tits up, a lot of sports have had it because of the monopoly dominance it has over so many sports, the financial dominance it has. That if you turn off the Sky taps, the income streams do dry up, and that's a problem you get when you've got basically a monopoly broadcaster. Same with a monopoly sponsor or a monopoly income stream, where X amount percentage of your income and X amount percentage of your customer reach, not your customer base, your customer reach, potential customers, is held by a handful of operators. So in football's case, obviously it's Sky with a huge chunk with BT as well. If BT goes tits up, which is looking hardly likely anyway, because it's BT, it's badly run, and it's losing money. But if BT goes tits up, it will have make a dent um, on the broadcast revenue, make a dent, because Amazon's deal is restricted to its size. However, if Sky was to go tits up, That's 70% of your TV revenue down the toilet, straight up. And as we know, these clubs aren't as profitable. These football clubs aren't as profitable as they claim. So if you imagine Sky going out of business or losing its operating license or facing some kind of crisis that it can't bounce back from, the financial impact upon the game at club level will ultimately obviously have a bigger impact on the international game and grassroots development and community projects, a whole host of other things. But you put that into perspective. Just think about that for a second. So if Sky was to go tits up and go out of business, think of the damage done to the Premier League football. Massive. Um, far bigger than COVID. Far bigger than COVID. If, for example, BT was to go out of business, the impact would be lessened. But yeah, you've got to think about the amount of sports. I mean, rugby league would be crucified. It would cease to exist as a professional sport literally overnight. The Channel 4 agreement is worth pennies. Rugby league would be done. Done. Quite frankly. Cricket, that's put all its eggs in one basket. Cricket's basically shot itself in the foot for the last 17, 18 years. Got no sympathy for the ECB. Got sympathy for cricket fans and the players and coaches and support staff, but I've got no sympathy for the ECB. Some of their commercial decisions since 2005 are a joke, and I think I'm within reason saying that. They went to properly milk the cash cow, and the sport is on its knees. They took the song. They decided to put the whole sport behind the paywall, and Ofcom and the powers that be didn't protect the international game either. So I've got no sympathy for the ECB. I've got sympathy for the sport as a whole, but I've got no sympathy for the ECB. They've basically changed the sport to a company that has a finite existence. Union would take a massive hit because there's not enough TV rights in Premier Sports and BT Sport to sustain the sport's growing wage bill. If rugby league could rugby league join Union in a structure? There's too much division within both league and union at governance level. Could the clubs merge? I've always said that's possibly the best solution to ensure the survival of both codes long term. Harlequins tried it with league and union at one point to mixed success. I will admit, mixed success. But I think there's too much distrust between union executives and league executives. There's too much resistance to cooperation and change. It's almost as if cooperation and change are perverse words to league and union executives. When league is trying to grow, union stamps it out. When union's trying to grow, league stamps it out. Wales is a key battleground where both codes physically hate each other and will do their best to hamper and damage each other as much as possible and do nothing to grow either code. They're more obsessed with harming their rival more than benefiting themselves. I can't see it. It would be a very good. It's a very good idea on paper, but in practice, it won't. It won't happen. I'm afraid. There's too much resistance to cooperation and change. Hello, Dan. I've been a bit under the weather the last couple of days. I've had a bit of a viral head cold. So I went to work yesterday and they sent me straight home. And I was really not well yesterday. I was terrible. Today I've been a bit better. I'm going back to work tomorrow, whether I should be or not. Another thing, I said, look, I'll come in tomorrow, whether you think I should be or not. I said, you can send me home or keep me on my feet. And they were like, okay. So there is that. Um, so could rugby league and rugby union coexist? They've proven they can't. They've proven they try their best to harm each other, which does nothing for the image of both codes of sport players. It does nothing for the PR image of all-inclusive family sport. Um, and the league is in a terrible crisis, and a lot of that's to do with how the RFL have governed the game for many years. There's too many layers of governance. It's so confusing. I mean, who's actually running the game? Again, Sky TV have far too much say over the TV rights, and now that Channel 4 and the BBC have got a stake. Okay, it's a better situation, but at the same time, that should have been the case from the beginning, and hasn't been. So the sport is in a bit of a tight situation. The money's, well, Bradford being the main example. Bradford Bulls, obviously, they're, I think, 2 or 3 administrations now. The Widnes Vikings have had their money issues. And there's a few clubs currently in the Super League that financially just shouldn't be there. A lot of the clubs in the Championship are far better run. That's what's generally terrifying in the second division, where ironically is less money. Clubs are actually ironically better run, which just shouldn't be the case. But then the London Broncos having to go to a part-time player basis from full-time professionals, so only half, well, proportion of the squad's full-time, but they've gone to a part-time semi-pro club now. Tells you all you need to know about the situation in the sport. And COVID has obviously had an impact. There's no doubt on that. But it tells you that instead of with the TV deal they signed with Sky all those years ago, and the constant extensions to that TV contract, they haven't. So yeah, you had your 40-page paper due yesterday. It went really well. I leaned heavily into your suggestions of playing up a rivalry. Did it with the Leafs due to proximity. Okay, the Buffalo Sabres, and pricing them out to attract the lower class. You want to get the ticket price right to attract fans with lesser incomes. Lower class is a very old-fashioned term to say poor. You want to attract a wider demographic of fan base. There'll be some who can't afford to go to as many games. You want to, as I say, look at season ticket packages or game packages, match night tickets available actually on the door. And look at various things, because as a sports fan, I hate the corporate tickets. I really do. Now I've been fortunate to receive corporate gratuities through friends and family. I've got, look, companies giving us some tickets to a sports game. Do you want to come? Obviously, free stuff. But most corporates may not be fans of that sport. They stay for a little bit, are uninterested, and leave. So I'm not a massive fan of the corporate giveaways, even though I've actually been a beneficiary of corporate giveaways in my time. Through my mum's work and some friends as well who've had corporate giveaways as part of work bonuses, or length of service duration. Every so many years you've been here, you get some freebies. And while I can understand some of the logic behind that, when some teams make too much use of the corporates to fill attendance, and then you've got paid an actual attendance, you see those empty seats in the corporate boxes. It's not a great look when the attendance actual versus the attendance paid are two different things. And that's been a big debating point in a lot of sports for a long time. But no, I hope it all went well, and I hope obviously you get some good grades and good marks on it, and I hope obviously I gave you some good ideas. As I say, I'm not a university student. Okay, I've never done a university degree. I've never gone past. Um, you know, yes, I did some adult courses beyond secondary education, and each country has a different education system and how they structure their their primary, secondary, and tertiary, and then further education. But I've never done a university course. I've never done you know um, uh, you know that level of education. I've done the level just below that. And yeah, 40 pages. That doesn't seem like a lot, but it actually is. It really is. Some students have been cheeky and they've got 40 pages, but they're typing it and they use a slightly larger typeface. So it's still 40 pages, but in reality it'd be like 36. Um, but no, I hope it does go well. I'm glad you're satisfied with what you wrote up and looking at you know the sports issues you were discussing, and you're obviously looking at a particular team. I'm assuming that it's to do with the fact you are actually based in New York, and therefore it is a local sports team, professional sports team, playing at the highest level, not having a lot of success, having some of the lowest crowd numbers it's ever had, going through a rough patch on and off, on and off the ice with Buffalo Sabres. So if that was your case study and you have to do something around that case study, I hope it has gone well, and I hope obviously it, use your Vegas game in intro idea. Our secondary target market was lower class French Canadian fans. Buffalo is surrounded by hockey hotbeds. Give fans a cheaper option than Toronto, New York Rangers, Pittsburgh. Look, the interesting thing about Buffalo as a city, not just as a sports location or a sports market, is the way you North Americans like to define areas. Is you've got New York, what 4 or 5 hours away, where not only do you have the Rangers and the Islanders, but you have the other major leagues with teams as well. I think all the major leagues, and I will include Major League Soccer in this, and even Major League Rugby are the New York team. So there you go. Every other professional league in the US and Canada has a team in New York. So that is a vibrant sports market, very vibrant sports market. And then, of course, you've got Boston and you've got Montreal. You've got the Toronto metropolitan area. Uh, Obviously, you've got Pittsburgh and Philly. Although Philly and Pittsburgh, ironically, are not as wealthy as a lot of people in Europe would realise. In fact, North America, especially the US, is a country of contrasts. It really is a country of contrasts um, between the wealthiest and the poorest, and how some states are actually significantly lower down on average salary and job progression and local economy, whereas other states are actually surprisingly wealthy for average salary. The interesting thing is, it's just the New York State and New England. Other than the New York metropolitan area, you've got Boston and Baltimore, and Buffalo is an exception because it's inland, it's not on the coast, and it's on the border with Canada. All the others, Boston, Baltimore, New York, are all on the coast, and they're further south, and are ironically very, very close to each other geographically. So Buffalo, in a sense, in the US is in a bit of isolation. The only thing that makes up for that is the fact that, as a sports market, it's right on the border with Canada, and a lot of Canadian fans, whether they are ice hockey or American football or whatever it may be, um, Buffalo is quite unique in that regard, as it's the only major sports city in the US that's right on the border with Canada. It's right on the border. It's got border crossings. It's a very unique position that Buffalo is in. Uh, so it has ironically, a wider population catchment area than teams in New York, for example. It really does. And there are ice hockey fans in Toronto or in Montreal um, who may not support the Canadians or the Maple Leafs, especially in Toronto. Toronto being a very metropolitan, cosmopolitan, global city, they may not be fans of the Maple Leafs. A lot of people who live in Toronto come from all over Canada, so they're, you know, Buffalo is in a unique position to maximise upon that. The problem that Buffalo has faced is both its major league franchise teams are not very successful historically. Now, while they've been to finals and they've made playoffs in the past, that lack of continued success and consistency is a major problem. Now, Buffalo is famed for its fanatical fan bases, both the Sabres and the Bills Mafia. Even over here, the Bills Mafia is a known thing, the fanatical fan base. And European fans do respect that fanatical fan base, even in the face of the team being absolutely woeful. Excuse me. But that lack of continued success or competitive level is a problem. Um, wow, did you know Buffalo had three professional sports teams started in 1970? Bills, Sabres, and Braves. Imagine City having three pro sports teams in 1 year today. Very hard to imagine that. Very, very hard. Um, and excuse me. Well, would it be viable having three rival sports set up in the same location at the same time in the US? Um, it is interesting that basketball obviously wasn't a success in Buffalo, considering that basketball and ice hockey use indoor arenas that are normally multi-purpose for both sports. You would have thought American football would have failed because of the climate in Buffalo winter, but the Bills have survived and continue to have that fanatical fan base. Um, that is very, very unique. Buffalo is a unique sports market, as I said. But a city that size in Europe might have two two teams in the same sport. And what I find interesting is when they go, LA and New York can sustain, two teams in the same sport, which they do. A city the size of LA or New York in Europe, like London, look how many professional football clubs London has. Not necessarily in the top flight, but in all divisions. You could actually have your own separate league just for London. And it used to be the case with rugby union until some of them actually relocated out of London to other locations as the years went by. And then you you look at you know um, other cities in Europe where they instead of having the one major league team like Milan and Rome have two clubs who share the same stadium. So in Milan you've got AC and Inter. In Rome or Roma you have Roma and Lazio. So to save on running costs, the clubs share the same stadium. Yeah, and then you look at Madrid and Barcelona. You've got Espanyol and Barcelona, and then you've got Atletico and Real Madrid and Madrid. Um, you've got Real Betis and Sevilla in Seville in Spain. Now, some of these cities are a far smaller urban area um, than New York for population. In fact, all the cities I've listed are smaller in population than New York or LA, apart from, I think, London. Um, Yet they can sustain top level professional clubs. Um, it's Getafe and Rayo Vallecano. Technically, they're in the Madrid metropolitan area, but they're not actually in the actual city of Madrid. They're just in the state which Madrid is in, the capital state, or whatever it's called in Spain. So Getafe and Rayo Vallecano are actually outside of Madrid, but they come under it's like Greater London. Not all of Greater London is London. Like Greater Manchester, not all of it's Manchester. Um, but Greater Manchester and London and Greater London is two political and geographical entities. You could have two separate, or you could have your own separate football league with three divisions. Um, um, So I find it interesting when sports commentators in the US are going, well, could this city sustain a second sports team? Could this city split the fandom? And I'm scratching my head going, these are big cities in the US and they're worried about a second professional sports team. Barcelona is not one of the biggest cities in the world. It's about 1 point something million in the metropolitan area. That's not the city proper, that's the suburbs and satellite cities. One of the biggest city in the world is Tokyo, with 20, is it 22, 20, 25 million people in Tokyo? Um, London Broncos are in real danger of being relegated to League One. Well, this is the mess that the RFL and Super League have made of running the game. Yes, you could argue the Broncos were a little bit uh, were running in an unsustainable fashion. Oh, where have we heard that before? They've had to go for part-time status. Now, not all the clubs in the Championship have part-time status. They're already at a disadvantage, and a lot of their best players are left. Um, Wasps moving to Coventry hasn't been a huge success. 33,000 seat stadium. Wasps get 10,000. Coventry City get 20,000. The stadium is just too. Look, it was called the Rico for a very long time. It's the Coventry City Stadium is the official term for it. When you've got sponsorship reasons, it's something else. I work with a Coventry City fan, and no, Stu is hilarious because he's in his 50s, but he doesn't look in his 50s. He looks a lot younger than he is. And he's a wealth of football banter and footballing knowledge, and he's a really hilarious guy. Obviously, he remembers Highfield Road. Obviously, Highfield Road was a smaller stadium than the Rico. However, the Rico was in planning before they got relegated from the Premier League. Much like Everton are playing their new stadium, it was designed for a Premier League club, not a Football League club. Now, Coventry have been all the way up and down the Football League, and have been. And the stadium issue is one of the reasons why Coventry are not back at the top table of the English game. And you could, yes, Coventry is a football city over other sports. Other sports do very well. You've got Coventry Blaze in ice hockey. You've got rugby union in Coventry. You have got rugby league in Coventry. Then you've got Wasps. The Wasp situation and the way that relocate. I mean, I'm not a massive fan of relocating all the rugby union teams out of London, but the RFU sanctioned a lot of it. Premiership Rugby sanctioned it. Um, so you've got clubs like Saracens and Wasps, London Irish, London Welsh have gone out of business now, but they're another club. Most of the London clubs were actually based originally out of Richmond. Now, when the game went professional, they need to find more uh, hardy stadiums because the Richmond Rugby Club, which is basically where a lot of them still train, um, while it's a fantastic, Richmond's got a lot of green space. You can have a lot of playing pitches, and I've got friends who've actually played for a Richmond Rugby Club. And I went to school with some people who did summer camps there and training camp. It doesn't have the big grandstands, the big stadium in place. It really is amateur, grassroots level, what they would say in Australia, bush for rugby league and AFL. It's really that, not quite recreational, but not fully professional setup. So a lot of these clubs needed a more permanent stadium to play their games out of. Now, the only club in London to really find a permanent and always have a permanent home was Harlequins at the Stoop, right by Twickenham. Harlequins obviously built those foundations at the Stoop and have, turned the Stoop into a fantastic facility. It really is. Beautiful little stadium. Obviously, Bath got the Rec, Gloucester, all the clubs outside London. But the problem is the London clubs moving out. It hasn't. I don't think it has been the success that the RFU and the Premiership Rugby, in a sense of crowd numbers, were hoping for and image were hoping for. I mean, what's happened with Saracens, obviously, in recent years, the negativity surrounding Saracens, That's damaged the image of the sport badly. Whether they were obviously now Leicester have done the same things. It's not just Saracens being naughty boys. It's multiple clubs. Wasps going to come. The thing is, the professional era clubs needed more permanent home stadiums with grandstands, bigger capacities. This is what they were banking on. That rugby union would be this rival to football. So you needed the infrastructure to back it up. Now, obviously, London Welsh had gone out of business and they were using the Kassam Stadium in Oxford. London Irish were using what was the Medeas, which is now the Select Lease Car Stadium in Reading for many years. I don't know if they still are. They might be, but they were. You had Vicarage Road being used, I believe, by Wasps. I think it was by Saracens. You had Wycombe Wanderers Stadium used by one of them. So they were using, stadiums in and around London and the Thames Valley. And then Wasps actually bought what was the Rico, which is now the Coventry City Stadium. Wasps are now the owners of that stadium. The owner's Sisu. I don't know everything about the situation with what was the Rico for sponsorship reasons, the new stadium in Coventry, but Wasps are now the owners of that stadium. They lease the stadium to Coventry City for match days, which I think is bizarre because it was built for Coventry City in the first place. You couldn't make this business arrangement up. But I don't think that the problem is a lot of the rugby union clubs, apart from Harlequins, are basically homeless. I think the only other one to now have a permanent home is Saracens with what they've built in place. You could argue that Loftus Road. It's an intimidating atmosphere at Loftus Road, but it is what it is. If Loftus Road was to get a rebuild, they could definitely adjust the width of the pitch, the width of the ingoals. I think at some point Loftus Road does get a refurb, but we'll see what happens with Loftus Road. But yeah, the fact that most clubs that were based in London or still are technically without a stadium, they're technically homeless, which is one of the reasons why London Welsh no longer exist. Is they just were so the deal with Kassam, then financial mismanagement in London Welsh. Obviously, what happened to London Welsh happened to London Welsh. But in all seriousness, rugby union, the club game is it's difficult when half your clubs technically are struggling to figure out agreements for ground sharing or leasing stadiums. And that includes in the lower levels like London Scottish, London Japanese. A lot of them, I think London Scottish were playing out of Esher at one point. And it is kind of a worry where their stadiums have to meet this criteria to be top flight, which is why Richmond could not be used as a top flight facility, which is why a lot of these clubs have gone into ground shares or relocated, is because traditionally where they were playing doesn't meet the Premiership standard, which I think is a bit ridiculous. I mean, yeah, obviously the game has changed massively since I was a kid, and obviously professionalism is part of that change. Obviously, I was alive before the professional era, and now I'm alive post-professional era. So yes, in that regard, I can pass comment. And absolutely, we can definitely argue that yes, Rosslyn Park is a good facility for the level it's used at. The rugby at semi-professional level across the country is rugby union is quite good and quite fun to watch. The problem is facilities and stadium infrastructure. So while the World Cup in 2015 was brilliant to watch and see the stadium infrastructure that was used, be it rugby union or football clubs, and there was a lot of football stadiums that was used, such as Brighton Stadium and such, and St James's Park, so the Amex at St James's Park. Sandy Park in Exeter was used, and that's a fantastic little facility. I mean, Exeter as a city has two fantastic sports teams, and St James's Park and Sandy Park are two fantastically well run and well maintained, what I would call little facilities in regards to some of the bear moths in professional sport. But rugby union, as well as rugby league, has infrastructure issues that, while we've had the rugby union World Cup and we've had several rugby union World Cups in the Northern Hemisphere, and we've had several rugby league World Cups, the last one being in 2013, that sporting legacy, that's what I'm going to use here, the injection of interest and funds and growth of the sports hasn't carried on. And obviously delaying last year's Rugby League World Cup to this year, I think, has had a massive negative impact on the sport going forward. It's a problem. Yeah, quite possibly Coventry Rugby Football Club could have gone professional if Wasps hadn't moved in. Again, it's I don't know how I feel about the relocation of some of these teams. Obviously, the clubs and the sport have got to do what is the best economic decision for them. But can you imagine if a club because Wasps is a big club and a very successful club historically, and it's had great international players play for it. But can you imagine if a club like an Arsenal or a Tottenham was to actually move outside of London into Hertfordshire, or West Ham moved into Essex, even though West Ham would have the fan base out there? Can you imagine the uproar that would be had? It's like Crystal Palace moving in Crawley, for example, in Sussex. It wouldn't go down well with the fan base. The fact that they've moved to Coventry, I'm not sure how all Wasps fans feel about that. And it is a shame when a club feels it's not financially viable to continue with. I can't remember if Wasps. I think Wasps were playing out of Wycombe's. I think they were playing out of Wycombe's home ground. Because I know Saracens were using Vicarage Road. I believe they were playing out of Wycombe's home ground for a long period of time. Long period of time. And obviously, it wasn't viable to continue to do so. Now, yeah, I mean, relocation. It's what I call the North American model, and I don't think it goes down well with traditional fans. I don't think it does go down well at all. Now, whether whether it's inevitable, isn't it? I think obviously it would have been nice to see Wasps and Saracens in their traditional locations in and around Greater London. But how many stadiums are in and around Greater London that meet Premiership standards? The capacity and seated attendance and standing attendance and everything in between. I'm not a massive fan of the franchise American style model of the team struggling in a location, rather than have a look at why the team is struggling financially in that location, whether they're having success or not, or why the team is struggling. Let's try and fix it. We'll just move the team as the solution, which is not generally the case. there's normally multiple reasons why a team is struggling in a location, and a lot of the reasons is there's a disconnect between the ownership and the fan base. Who would have thought? But yes, so rather than trying to look at ideas to solve the problem by keeping them in location, um, they go for this rather, what I would think, uh, there's a word for it, uh, barbaric concept of we'll just move the team, rather than to try and figure out why there is an issue with team in that location. I'll just move the team. Jim Radcliffe's 4.25 billion offer for Chelsea has been rejected out of hand, which now means that the new owner of Chelsea, should the deal go through, will be an American. Roy Hodgson will not be managing Watford next season. Maradona's Hand of God shirt sells for 7.1 million. There's some other. Green Bay Packers are to face the New York Giants in the October London series. So there's only 3 NFL games this year being played in London in October. The Green Bay Packers will be playing the New York Giants on the 9th of October. The Minnesota Vikings and New Orleans Saints play on the 2nd of October in the Tottenham Stadium. The Jacksonville Jaguars will play the Denver Broncos at Wembley Stadium on the 30th. And there's a regular season game, which would normally be the 4-game London series, being played in Germany for the first time. The Tampa Bay Buccaneers will take on the Seattle Seahawks in the Allianz Arena on the 13th of November. So that's interesting. And the Arizona Cardinals will be playing a game in Mexico City on a date yet to be announced. There's going to be 5 overseas games for the NFL next season. So there's some other bits and pieces. Where's the Giants game being played? It's at Spurs. So London gets 3 games this year. Munich gets 1, and there's going to be 1 played in Mexico. So what was just the London series has now become truly the international international series. It's a shame South London doesn't have a Premiership rugby union club, because football south of the river is a religion, regardless of the success of the clubs south of the River Thames. Look how many players have come through from South London to play the game professionally. Rugby union just doesn't have that impact that football does. So Green Bay versus New York Giants is one of the 2 games at the new White Hart Lane. 2 games per year for 10 years. And still Tottenham can't win trophies with all that money coming in. Who would have thought? The fact that the London series, I think Green Bay is the last team to play overseas, and there's only 30 teams in the NFL. So Green Bay is the last team to play. The Green Bay Packers is the last team to play an overseas game. But yeah, what was the London series has been going since 2007 and has now spawned what is now known as the international series, playing games in Mexico and Germany as well. It's gained a momentum all of its own, and still there is there's the discussion about, will there be a professional NFL team in London? It's it's an interesting one. Um, so as I've said, I've done videos looking at potential of a London team or a I think I'll do a video on what's the potential of a London Super Bowl. To be fair, um, I think a London Super Bowl is more likely than having a permanent London team. There you go. There's one for you. I think London is more likely to host a Super Bowl over having a London franchise. Um, so that to me, the European Football League or whatever it is, is always talking about putting a semi-pro team in London. Oh yay! Who's actually going to want to go and watch that? What I find really is in. Oh dear. What I find really interesting about our obsession with things American, yet when they decide to buy one of our sports teams or put an idea in, we reject it. Weird that. Who's going to really want to watch the ELF in London? Like seriously, who is going to want to watch that? And let's be brutally honest here. Who's actually going to want to watch that? Like, there's a reason why NFL Europe failed the first time. There's a reason why the CFL, struggles to get a foothold in the US. Um, and the XFL going out of business twice, the AAF failing to get past its first season. There are reasons why American football struggles outside the US and even inside the US. The 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 economics of it and the economic structures of American football are chronically flawed. That the collegiate game gets bigger TV figures than the professional game, which is madness. There's no secondary level to develop players, so either you make it or you don't. And there's a reason why NFL Europe failed the first time and why it is delusional. And each country's got a different sporting culture, and and with this current situation with the rising cost of living and people tightening their belts, and whose bright idea is it goes, oh yeah, I know what we'll do. We'll put a brand new sports team of whatever level in a city that's already got one of the highest costs of living in the Western world. Madness. The XFL still exists. It will resume in 2023, but it's obviously doing really well because it didn't resume over the last 2 years, and it failed the first time, and it cost the McMahon family a huge chunk of change. And I know The Rock's got involved with it, but he's a McMahon employee basically. I mean, come on, he made his name working for them in WWE, WWF, and it is a flawed product, massively flawed product. Um, and there's a growing resistance to the Americanization of sport in Europe, the globalization, Americanization, whatever you want to call it. In there is a growing resistance, which is why European fans haven't fallen in love with PSG or Man City because they see it as these plastic football clubs that have been bought by people who don't understand the history, the plastic fans who haven't actually read up on the history of what it meant to these football clubs in the years, decades before the purchase of their current owners. And that's my view on that. In regards to the XFL still existing. I'm amazed it's still going. It's that's a basket case of a league. Um, whether it gets any positive success out of and growth out of, it's, what's it, third attempt now to try and get the league running. That's a wait and see moment. Um, but no, I mean, there's a lot of resistance to the commercialization, over commercialization. I think is the better way to put it, and the Americanization. Um, I say Americanization, but globalization is possibly the best way to describe it. But we'll go with Americanization because that's what spawned this globalization model of sport. Um, and I think I'm going to say the last 5, 10 years, I think COVID accelerated the resistance and the pushback. But it's noticeable now that the fans are basically giving up, you know, in the sense that they've just had enough, basically. I think the fan protests that we've seen in recent years before COVID, um, the reaction to the planned European Super League, I think, tells you all you need to know about how fans feel, um, in regards to how direction the owners are taking. You're basically taking the piss out of your own customer base, and if you turn off the traditional fans, the ones who make up the majority of your local revenue, notice that's ticket sales that keep the stadium running. Basically, that's the merchandise sales from the club shops that you directly own that aren't online, where you get a percentage of the online sale. When you piss off your local fan base over your global fan base notwithstanding in this case, yeah, you're going to feel the financial hit. So the reaction to the European Super League was so visceral and toxic that very, very quickly, most of the clubs went, you know what, we're out of this. And it was a Man United Liverpool led idea. So the Fenway Sports Group and the Glazers were principal um, agents in coming up with the league idea and pushing it as an agenda, trying to get clubs like Man City and Chelsea on board because they are the newly wealthy in regards to English football. Um, Obviously, Real Madrid and Barcelona always want to give one to UEFA, so they were going to sign up anyway, regardless if it was going to cost them money or not. But they realised we're bankrupt. We need to make a revenue stream without UEFA, you know, taking their legitimate fee from it. Um, so the clubs that got involved really didn't give a toss about their fan. The reason why PSG didn't get involved is it would have been even worse PR for a club that's already got issues off the field and they're already being investigated yet again for some dodgy dealings. Man City are being investigated yet again for some dodgy dealings. So some of these clubs were a little bit reluctant if to get on board with it. But it's only been 12 months and the feeling hasn't changed in a year. The feeling hasn't changed with us, the sports fans. So it could be football, it could be rugby union, it could be rugby league, it could be doesn't matter what the sport is. The feeling hasn't changed. The fact that North American fans, and this is where I think Dan is quite an interesting. I'd ask Dan the question in the last live stream about certain viewpoints from certain things. As an American fan, Dan, how did you feel about the European Super League? What were your thoughts on it as an American fan of the sport? What were your thoughts on it? Do you think that going forward, is that European Super League type model the way to restructure the European club game when it comes to the Champions League, Europa League, etc.? Or would you look at the history of the European Cups, bring back the Cup Winners' Cup, which is what I would like to do, and change the structures to straight knockouts, which they used to be until the 90s when UEFA started bringing in group stages. So I want to see what an American fan feels about how UEFA is governed sport, plus the domestic FAs, um, in regards to how they govern the game in Europe, and what an American fan feels about the European Super League and the aftermath and the backdrop, bear in mind the Euros were about to take place, so how those players and fans would have been distracted going into, especially the players, going into a major tournament. And the timing of that. By the way, we've got this idea when the season wasn't completely finished, technically, and you had a major tournament literally about to start, and they do the what I say the mic drop and go bang, here's our idea. So Dan, I want to see what you feel about that, because that's quite interesting. It's always very interesting having a non-European or a non-British viewer in the chat, because I can ask these type of questions and I can get a different, sometimes a different viewpoint, might be the same viewpoint, and you are allowed to disagree with what I say. This is the whole point of this channel, is there's allowed to be a bit of disagreement and discussion, because I feel that the European Super League idea is not going to fully go away. I don't think that it ever rises its ugly head to the level it was at this time last year, but I do think unless UEFA really properly enforce these spending rules going forward that they're going to bring in, properly punish the club. And I do. This is where I believe Serafin is the right guy. Now, these 12 clubs felt Serafin was weak, and he wasn't. Um, Investors are only interested in money and profit. Yes, that's why I'm not a big fan of these capital investment firms like CVC buying huge chunks of rugby union. Um, um, Investment capitalists, buying like huge chunks of rugby union and such, because that's a concern. To be honest, the Super League came out like 2 months after into me being excited about the sport. The idea seemed like a fever dream that it was too good to be true initially, but then after learning more about it, how do you feel now after a full year of reading into what went into it, how fans responded? Obviously you had just got into the sport this time last year. You were new to it. Again, a lot of Americans are still very, very infant in the idea of what you call soccer, what we call football. A lot of American fans are new to the sport, and of course, the traditional fans will go, "Well, they're plastics. They don't know the history." Da, 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 da. But in order for the sport to grow, it needs new fans. So again, after you've learnt more about the European Super League idea, Dan, how do you feel now? Pat McAfee was getting loads of crap for saying on Twitter he thought it was a good idea. Pat McAfee is an American. Okay, now I'm not saying Pat McAfee is wrong. I'm saying I disagree fundamentally with his opinion. The issue with Pat McAfee is he's not stupid. That's what is very interesting. I could happily sit down with Pat McAfee and basically say you are an arsehole, which would be disingenuous to him because he's not stupid. He isn't. But again, he's quite new to the sport itself and understanding the history of the sport and what it means and the direction the sport's taking. And he's coming to it from an American investing point of view. He wasn't coming at it, I don't think, from an ex-player or a fan's point of view, from a European or South American point of view. He's coming from it from a North American sort of investment point of view. Okay, Dan, you definitely see the flaws in it. I think bringing regular season games overseas would do very well to grow the sport here, but I think the setup now is really entertaining. Why change it? Thank you. In order to bring regular season games over here, they would have to completely rewrite the rules regarding club licenses per season. Basically, you have to play every home game at the same stadium, which is why Tottenham had to play at Wembley, even though they could have played at White Hart Lane sooner. It was to meet their license obligations. There are rules in place where you have to play every single home game at the same stadium. So you believe the European Super League is inevitable? Dear. I think the way you wait. We'll see what happens. I can't. Fans, young and old, in the European market, the way they reacted, I cannot see going forwards how they can justify resurrecting it at any point, because the reaction was so almost violent. Um, I can't see them being brave enough to do it again. And that then puts the jitters on for investors. It does put the jitters on for investors. Any investor with half a brain would be going, we can't sell this to our existing hardcore fan base, our hardcore customers. These guys will turn up week in, week out, keep buying the product. If we risk turning them off, we've just damaged the product irreparably. We have cost ourselves X amount of million per match day, X amount of million per week in revenue. We risk losing more than we gain when it comes to costing, profit over expenditure margins. But they were saying that in '94, and it's taken until quite recently for the MLS to actually become profitable and self-sustaining. So they said that in '94 with the USA '94 FIFA World Cup, and it did take the best part of 10 to 15 years for the MLS to actually be a self-sustaining, viable league. Um, but you're coming again from it from an American perspective, and a lot of American fans were actually against the idea as well, because they like the fact that we have the tradition, they like the fact we have promotion relegation, which is different from the North American sporting model. Um, the historical link between clubs and the communities they play in, MK Dons notwithstanding. Um, but again, you've got to look at this upon the backdrop of the scandal the sport has had off the field with corruption over many years as well. There's a growing dissatisfaction with how FIFA operates. The sport is governed, and I've done this to death on the channel. I do honestly feel that the governance has been weak for a very long time. And while you've got Pat McAfee, who is a big name in social media and sports social media in the US, and he has a very big following in Europe as well. Well, he is again looking at it from an American point of view, more on the corporate side. If and this is where I think America as a general get things very badly wrong when dealing with other nationalities and the way other countries do things. They do get things wrong with their heavy-handedness in regards to throw money at the problem disappears. That's not necessarily the case. Engagement is key, and unfortunately, the club owners, of which a proportion were American-based, did not engage well with the fan base. Uh, it won't happen in the MLS because it's a franchise-based model, and the team owners wouldn't be happy because they paid X amount to enter via an expansion fee to then be told, "Oh, by the way, you're playing in the second tier." Um, the MLS is like every other major league. Um, so that idea, while in practice, obviously would work in implementation because of the sporting culture and the country you'll be dealing with, doesn't. Um, it is what it is. And you'll be asking owners to make massive losses in order to restructure the MLS to suit a promotion relegation system. And yeah, capitalists don't like losing money. Wealthy people like getting wealthier. Um, so in order, yeah, wealthy people don't like unnecessarily losing money, and to them that would be an unnecessary loss which they would not accept, quite frankly. Um, Whether that's right or wrong is another thing, but um, they will just not accept that kind of financial hit in their wallet. in their back pocket. It's just not feasible to implement with the ownership model and the league model that is currently in place with the MLS. It's just not a feasible idea to put before the ownership of the MLS franchises, a promotion relegation model. While it might make the league a better product, it won't necessarily grow the product because it's the US model, which is the franchise model. And what owner is going to want to pay an expansion fee and then be told, by the way, your team is going to be playing in the second or third division of our pyramid, but you've just paid X amount of 10 or 20 or 30 or 40 or 100 or X amount of millions to enter a league system, to be then told maybe a year or 10 years down the line, by the way, we're plonking your team in second or third tier of our organisation. It's not going to sit well with a handful of very rich individuals who invested a lot of money in capital. No, I'm not saying that all the MLS owners will be against that, but your lost revenue is going to be a thing, and I'm not sure how easy it would be to implement such a policy. Um, and I don't think it happens. While I think a lot of fans would possibly like to see it happen, I don't see any willingness from the MLS to copy the European system. I think the MLS is now too far established down the line. Just read that during my initial reaction was, yeah, bringing promotion relegation, and then thought about Toronto FC going down and not being able to see them play. Well, I think a lot of fans and especially a lot of new fans, are growing knowledge about the sport and how the sport operates. And they're learning how the sport operates in other locations. To them, it's an alien concept. That's what I gather from a lot of American fans. Is it's an alien concept, the way our leagues and our sports are set up to operate. Um, and in that regard, I would have to agree with the fact that as it's a franchise model, it's going to have to stay the way it is, at least in the short to medium term. Whether like the leagues eventually get too big and they have to bring in, 32 teams is, I think, the largest a franchise-based league in North America can get to. I can't see the NHL, for example, going past 32. And then you have the conferences and division breakdown. So they can do it where in the MLS you may not play other teams from the other conference for a couple of years. In regards to player welfare, then that comes down to squad size and how they structure the regular season and playoffs in order that players aren't overplayed and the player welfare is put first and foremost. That's a big conversation that's being had, is player welfare. But what I find interesting is when I do a player welfare video, the view counts for that are really notoriously low. So when like a player has a severe head injury, like a severe concussion, or has to retire because of repetitive injuries, we go, oh, what a shame. And then there'll be an article or multiple articles about this player's career and the injuries for like a couple of days, and then we move on to the next sports story. And obviously, like if you look at the NHL, Mario Lemieux missed so many seasons with his back and cancer. He had cancer and he had horrific back injury, to the point where he couldn't bend down to lace up his skates. He couldn't sit on the aircraft on the flights to away games. He had to stand for the majority of intercontinental flights and international flights between the US and Canada. You've got the issue with, and then he had heart problems as well. But he was playing a fair chunk of his career with, well, basically a spine his spine was wrecked. And again, people were like, oh, he's amazing. He can play through this. Yes, but he shouldn't have to. While imagine if he was fully healthy, how he would have destroyed the league. Yes, but he shouldn't have to be in that position where his health is under question. But no one seemed to care that he was. They're going, "Oh, what a warrior! He's playing through this. He shouldn't have to. He deserves the right to get the treatment and the medical care, so he has a quality of life post play." But at the time, oh, he's a warrior. He's doing it for his team. Da, 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 da. Oh, he's going to be a cripple in later life. It's amazing that Mario Lemieux is actually not in a worse physical shape now, post playing, with his back and with his other health issues than he was when he was playing. When he was playing, he was in serious trouble in the 80s and the 90s with his back. Serious trouble that would have laid out many a player. And it shows his commitment to the sport and his drive and his willingness to win. Fine. But there's got to come a point where you've got to save the player from themselves. Unfortunately, the fact he was willing to play through the pain barrier and past what I think is generally acceptable. And I use him as an example. Johnny Wilkinson's another example. The amount of surgeries and health complaints Johnny Wilkinson had through his rugby union career. He was patched together for the 2003 World Cup, but in the years following, he had so many surgeries and so many times, his neck, shoulder, and back. Johnny Wilkinson, as a rugby union player, was held together with gaffer tape at one point, and he played for the best part of 20 years professionally. I think it was 18 years he was a professional, but the fact he played as long as he did with the injuries he's had is ridiculous. Who would I rather have, Carlos Alberto or Cafu, my right back? Cafu was better defensively. There's my answer on that one. There is no doubt on their skill. There's no doubt on their leadership abilities because they're both captains of Brazil. But I would rather have Cafu than Carlos Alberto simply because he was also better defensively. He didn't always have to be all the skill and flashiness, but he still had that flair in his game. But Cafu, just simply because if you're putting a team together, it doesn't have to be all these superstar all stars, and you're given the option of putting him in a team. He was far better defensively than Carlos Alberto. But again, he played in a different era. So when you're talking about comparing players who played 20, 30 years apart, that's precisely that. He played 20, 30 years after Carlos Alberto. So the game had evolved, the pace of the game, physicality in the game, different skills were utilised differently. Squads were balanced differently. There were phases where the game was more attacking, more defensive. And he did play in a different era, and he was different to Carlos Alberto because he was playing in Europe, which Carlos Alberto didn't do when he was a professional player. It wasn't seen as the done thing for South American players to play in Europe in large numbers, which is another difference. So you have to bear all these things in mind when you are comparing Cafu to Carlos Alberto. The style of football they played, the teams they played in, how you utilise the squad balance, the team balance, that winning mentality, a whole host of things. But I would have Cafu over Carlos Alberto because he was a little bit more defensively minded and a bit more solid defensively without the ball. Obviously, with the ball, very similar. But without the ball, you could rely on Cafu. If he was having a bit of a down game in an attacking sense, defensively, he would do the job that you were paying him to do as a right back or a right centre back. He would do the job you were paying him to do, which primarily would be defence primarily, then attack. So if he was having issues in attack where it wasn't quite clicking and the passes weren't going to feet and the movement, the opposition are shutting him down in an attacking sense, you could rely on him to do his defensive job first, a bit more over Carlos Alberto. The reason why that Brazil side in 1970 was so effective is they had the mentality of, we're going to go out and enjoy ourselves, and we're going to outscore the opposition, be it 1-0, 10-1. It didn't matter. They would have the mentality of play to win, but play with a smile on your face. Their mentality was different to other sides before and since, where there was always they were different. Um, that's one of the best goals of all time. Regularly voted one of the best goals of all time. It regularly ranks in the top 4 or 5 goals of all time on fan surveys and when it's shown to newer fans of the game and they're given an option to vote it, where they vote it, newer fans and older fans of the sport regularly rank that in their top 5 goal scoring moments in the history of the sport in the television era. So that's since 1962 or 1958, whichever way you look at the beginnings of the modern era as we would now know it. Obviously, we've got a World Cup at the end of this year. Some great goals will be scored that are ridiculous. What does it rank in terms of the importance in the history of the sport? The game is already won by that point. It's only with a few minutes remaining that he belts it in. He starts to move and he finishes it. Where does it rank? It's an iconic moment. It is an iconic moment considering what happened to Brazil in '66. And bearing in mind, on the way to that title, they had to beat England, the reigning champions in the group stage. They had to overcome Uruguay, who were one of the best sides in South America at the time. And Pele does his dummy round the Uruguay goalkeeper. I think his name was Blaskowitz. He was a world class goalkeeper in his day, and makes him look like an absolute fool. He then and they had they had to be a very good Italian side, and I think they were helped by the fact that Italy had to go through that mammoth semi final with extra time against what is now Germany, which was the former West Germany. And the effort and energy they had to put into that semi final, and bearing in mind Mexico, a lot of the locations used for the World Cup in 1970 and '86 were at altitude, and you're playing in exceptional heat and humidity. And back in the '70s and the '80s, the what we now call as player recovery, um, and you know, diet, hydration, warm down training, warm up training. Sports science wasn't a thing in 1970. And yeah, if you are a newer fan who hasn't done his research, you would not be aware that he is actually a wing back. But that's how good technically, skill wise, Brazil players have always been. I think that's not even the best goal in that World Cup. I think Gerson's belter from 40 yards earlier in the game to make it 2-1 is a better goal than Carlos Alberto's goal right at the end of the second half, and that's the beginning of the second half. It's 1-1 at half time, and then Brazil scored 3 goals in the second half because of the heat and humidity and the altitude. And it finally caught up with the Italian players who were just run out of steam because of what had happened in the semi final. The '86 World Cup as well, with Maradona and Argentina and what they did in the game. Maradona's second goal against England is not as good as his goal against Belgium in the semi-final. I think Maradona's second goal against England is one of the best individual goals, absolutely, for a powerful driving run at a defence that is unfortunately disorganised and has not done the press effectively. So they're disjointed in their press and they're disjointed in their organisation when they're forced to backtrack and retreat. But his goal against Belgium with the technique and the force that's going through his body when he twists to score the goal, and then you've got that rotation of his body to belt it past the Prudhomme in Belgian goal. That goal against Belgium in the semi-final, I think, is a far superior goal than his solo goal against England for his second goal. Again, that is subjective. Both those goals do feature in the top 10 lists quite regularly. So But I think I have seen better goals, be it team goals or solo goals. They are more iconic because of, you know, they're in knockout games, they're in finals. There are some better goals in the group stage or in the earlier knockout stages that have less of an impact on a tournament. Um, like the Argentina goal against Serbia Montenegro, the former Yugoslavia in 2006, where every player touched the ball at least twice, and Cambiasso starts the move with Abadanzeri in the box. Keeper rolls the ball out to his feet, starts the passing move, and then I think 23 or 24 passes later, he scores the goal. Um, uh, Bang in the back of the net. For me, that's possibly the best goal I've ever seen live. And it's amazing to think that was 2006. It's now 2022. That was 16 years ago. Next month, 16 years ago that goal was scored. It seems like yesterday, that Germany World Cup in 2006. But in reality, that was half my life ago. How is South Africa's culture? How the football culture is done since the World Cup was hosted there? I don't think it's had a massive impact as much as the organisers and FIFA were hoping. There was more of an impact after they won the Africa Cup of Nations in '94 after apartheid than the 2010 tournament. I think it was more of an impact. Then, obviously, their rugby union and their cricket sides get more interest because, they're much better ranked within their respective sports and they have been world champions at World Cups. But they were the first hosts not to get out the group stage, which was historically significant. I don't think it's had the impact that FIFA were anticipating and the South African FA were anticipating. Let's be honest. There's not a lot of high-profile South African players playing outside South Africa, whereas in the '90s, ironically, there were a lot of South African players plying their trade in Europe. Lucas Radebe, Leeds United, Quinton Fortune at Man United, two examples that I use. So the quality of player being produced is less. And this is true about all the sports under the apartheid era. There were some world-class players. South Africa could have been a dominant sports power in the '70s, '80s, and weren't because of the apartheid sanctions, which now Russia facing their own similar sanctions. How long the sanctions against the Russian Federation and Belarus continue will have a bearing on there may be some top quality Russian and Belarusian athletes who we don't get to see on the international stage because of the international sanctions against their nations. But a lot of South African sports commentators and fans have been not critical. I think they understand why the political sanctions were in place against South Africa at the time. But they are accepting in the fact that their rugby union, their cricket, and even their football teams did suffer as a result because of apartheid, where they probably would have been even better had there been no sanctions against them at the time. And some players had very short international careers, which we felt was stunning over in the rest of the world when it came to international sport because of the apartheid sanctions. And it did ultimately lead to pressure being put upon the South African government to change their stance on a lot of things. So ironically, sporting sanctions and sanctions such as that, where you were cut off socially from the rest of the world, when you have been part of the global order before, do actually have the desired impacts. When the high-profile athletes are generally from the middle classes, they're generally quite well educated because the education system in a lot of countries has a link to sport, like the US with the collegiate NCAA system. If the US was to be put in the cold when it came to professional sport, it definitely would have an impact because the best overseas players would face sanctions going to play there. And what we've noticed in recent years, especially when it comes to the Olympics. Now, This year at the Olympics, obviously the players didn't go because of COVID. But at the previous Olympics in South Korea, when the NHL said we're not going, the players were very vocal about the lack of participation at the Olympics, very vocal. And they made it quite clear. And they did push for Olympic participation at this Winter Olympics. Now, obviously, for reasons that we now know, and in hindsight probably was the right idea, um, they didn't go. But it is in the CBA, so at the next Winter Olympics, don't be surprised if the, the players push for Olympic participation heavily in the upcoming CBA. Whenever that CBA comes for negotiation, I wouldn't be surprised. The playing group are very, very vocal about participation at the upcoming next Winter Olympics in 4 years' time. South African sports fans, aren't they? Yes, they are. The Premier League is a global brand. It's a global brand. And South African sports fans, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, I would argue that rugby union and cricket have a bigger reach because South Africa is better at those sports. But yeah, no, European football, Premier League and the other European leagues, it doesn't matter what the European league is. It does have a lot of interests, but rugby union and cricket, I think, are more stably supported. I think it's the better way to look at it because of the continued success the Proteas in cricket and the Springboks in rugby union have had over nearly 27, 28 years since the end of apartheid. So with the continued success that the rugby union program and the cricket program have had for the best part of 30 years, yes, the football team, they've won the Africa Cup of Nations, they've hosted the Africa Cup of Nations. I think while that first Africa Cup of Nations win in '94 obviously had a massive impact on the sport in a short to medium term, the World Cup in 2010 didn't have the lasting impacts. I think, FIFA and the organisers were hoping for. The most important goal in World Cup history is her second goal against Germany in '66, or Iniesta's goal against Holland in 2010. They're both in finals, though. I think it's Hurst's hat-trick goal. Simply because I say this, it's the first and only World Cup final hat trick. There you go. That's my view on Hurst's goal scoring in the '66 World Cup. I honestly believe his third goal has a bigger impact on the global game because it is the first and only World Cup final hat trick. Now, if and when another player equals or betters that with three or more goals in the final, that's up for wait and see. I think we can see the Zimbabwe rugby team becoming more competitive and maybe qualify for the next Rugby Union World Cup. I think the political and economic situation in Zimbabwe has to improve as well, and we are far, far off that improvement. A lot of the best and brightest Zimbabweans, or if you're white Rhodesians, have left Zimbabwe in the last 30 years. That brain and talent drain is being felt because you've got players playing in multiple sports who could play for Zimbabwe or represent Zimbabwe at international level, who have decided for whatever reason to represent other countries when it comes to international level competition. And I'm going to use one example, actually three examples, because there's three brothers, the Curran brothers, who play for England, the England setup. Sam, Ben, I think his name, I think the other one's Tom. Three Curran brothers. Technically, their dad, a former Zimbabwean player, he did unfortunately die young. But because of their father and their mother, ironically, they can, under the grandfather rule, because they've got a relative who's grandparent or parent, or even a sibling, for example, who's been born there, they can, by rights, qualify for Zimbabwe. They have chosen to play under the England system. Now, They've developed under the England system. They've been here since they were young children. But that's the type of the the talent drain, the brain drain, as it's called, economically and sporting wise, that Zimbabwe's had over the last 30 years. First under Mugabe, and now under the continuation of the political situation in Zimbabwe under the ZNC or wherever it is. Um, yeah, the thing is, you have to be a bit careful because dictatorships like sporting pedigree, so they'll give certain exemptions for some of those players. But in reality, if you're a white or mixed race or anti-government Zimbabwean, your life is pretty shit. Um, and I'm being brutally honest. If you are not of the ruling party, or if you're white or mixed race, your life is generally you don't want to live there. And unfortunately, predominant sporting talent in Zimbabwe is white or mixed race, and they've left in quite large numbers over the last 30 years. And I will use the Curran brothers as an example because their father ended up settling in England and stayed here, played the end of his career here, and sadly passed away quite young. Um, but they're now playing in the England setup. Um, they have no intentions of going back to Zimbabwe. The fact they're of, British origin anyway, Anglo-Irish origin anyway, is irrelevant. Byproduct of colonialism. But they're an example I would use. Um, there's a couple of rugby. There's a rugby player who's playing for Australia who's a Zimbabwean as well. There's a couple of them actually play league and union. Who were born in Zimbabwe. And again, Pocock, that's the one, Pocock. Zimbabwean by birth, came to Australia when he was like in his teenage years, and has gone on to be a wallaby with great success. African sports more popular in Europe or North America? I couldn't tell you on that one. The only nation in Africa that really has a global reach is South Africa when it comes to sport. It's the only nation, apart from the Africa Cup of Nations, the only nation with a sporting pedigree that has a reach outside of Africa is South Africa. It's cricket and it's rugby union. Africa Cup of Nations is more Europe. Although I don't know what the American fan base is for international football other than the World Cup. I like it. I like what P-Shot. Look, he's obviously had his frustrations with World Rugby and the direction World Rugby has taken. Obviously, he stood for the being president against Bill Beaumont. He feels frustrated with the direction the sport has taken over a long period of time. Let's be honest with that. What I call the plastic players or the project players, which is the Irish term. International selection rules are a joke, both in league and union. That it does need to be addressed because the selection protocols, the minimum requirement is residency permit. It's your minimum requirement. How long you have lived in a country to get your residency permit, and then depending on nation you're in, residency can lead to nationality and then getting your passport and your citizenship. Yeah, rugby union definitely needs to look at this. It's become an issue under professionalism, absolutely. A big issue under professionalism. It's bigger than people ever realised it would be. And I think Augustine P-Shot was right in on his platform that he stood on in 2019. Bearing in mind, this is a guy who fought tooth and nail to get Argentina recognised in international rugby union as a major nation. How does it harm them? It actually means the Pacific Island nations get to retain a lot of their top quality talent. And Scotland, it just shows you the issues Scotland had with player development, where it has to rely on overseas players to fill the gaps in its system that it can't fill. That's down to the Scottish Rugby Football Union failing in its remit to grow the game at grassroots, which is what every governing body should be trying its hardest to do, is growing a sport from its grassroots up. And I have to agree with P-Shot. Nations like Scotland have been lazy in player development for a very long time. Very long time. And there is a player base in Scotland, especially in the border regions in the Central Belt. The problem is with Scotland, there's not a lot of money in sport. No, it won't. It won't. When you say professional, you mean registered players? No, not even close. For registered players, you'd be lucky to fill. What's a stadium? For registered players, you'd be lucky to fill like Ross County's ground or something like that. England has the most registered players. So no, Scotland can't fill Murrayfield with registered players. No, not even close. Same with football players. There's an issue with grassroots level sport in Scotland and sports finance in Scotland. Scotland has major issues with sport, be it financially, investment, what money is available. Scotland has money issues when it comes to professional sport. It does rely heavily on grants from central government. It relies on charity funding, lottery funding for a lot of its sports infrastructure. And the professional sports that are played professionally are not on the same level as its English or European counterparts. Oh dear. In regards to fucking cold. I hate it's cold. In regards to Augustine Payshot and his views, I think he's thinking for the wider collective of the sport rather than an individual nation. Scotland have definitely taken advantage of the current international selection rules for having foreign nationals in their setup, and they've taken advantage of that very well for many years. It means they can put a competitive side on the field. The fact that a good portion of their team is South African or even Dutch, with Tim Viss's case, when his brother was captain of the Dutch national side, tells you all you need to know. Which highlights the issues there. And of course, Scotland won't be able to fill Murrayfield with registered players at its disposal. I think the amount of registered players playing in Scotland is about 5,000 at all levels, from professional down to amateur. The old grandparent rule, that's been in place for a long time, but that then leads to obscure. Oh, his granny lived here for 4 years or something. We've had this argument 20, 30 years ago. Bearing in mind, Martin Johnson nearly played for New Zealand when he was younger, before the professional era, because he'd spent some time under then selection rules. He had spent some time in New Zealand as a student, and therefore he was eligible under the selection rules allowed at the time to play for the All Blacks. And he was approached by the All Blacks to play for them in the early 90s. Now, thankfully, he didn't, from England's standpoint, because obviously he went on to win the World Cup with England in 2003. But Martin Johnson could have been an All Black. In order for him to stay an All Black, however, he would have had to have stayed in New Zealand to play his club career there permanently. Obviously, when it was amateur level, an amateur, not financially viable, although he was living and working in New Zealand at the time. Obviously, it ended up, he went to Leicester, played his professional and senior career at Leicester, and the rest is history. But there was a period in the early 90s, before obviously Martin Johnson became a Leicester hero and an England hero, where the selection rules were slightly different. And he nearly ended up playing for New Zealand. Now, I have to look into the reasons why he decided not to play for New Zealand at senior level, but he had played a couple of under-23s matches or under-21s games for New Zealand because he was a student out there and he met the criteria. I think he was under-21s. He played, I think, 3 tests under-21s level. Now, he could have chosen to play for the All Blacks, and the whole history of rugby would have been completely different. And again, that was on residency because he was over there as a student. But we're seeing this argument in football as well now, and it's a difficult one. I mean, we've had it with Declan Rice with England, swapping Ireland for England, and the reaction to that in the Irish media was visceral. It's not a very popular mood, not a very popular decision in the Emerald Isle when Declan Rice decided to play for England in the build-up to last year's Euros. They should have been played 2 years ago. And Kevin Kilban is an ex-Ireland international who was born in Preston, but his parents were Irish, and he had the same dilemma whether to go for Ireland or for England. And while he's not the most recognisable player, if you're of a certain age, you'll know who Kevin Kilban is. Played for Sunderland amongst other clubs in the Premier League and the Football League. And he spoke very eloquently on the topic of, well, if you are eligible to play for Ireland or England, it's a very difficult choice because with England you've got more chance of having success and going further in tournaments. And if you want to play for the bigger clubs, you again gain that recognition at the European level. But the Declan Rice situation in football was quite similar. Diego Costa switching from Brazil to Spain, that was on residency, but he had met the maximum number of caps before you were allowed to change your nationality. He played 3 times for Brazil, and he was allowed to swap nationality. Same with Declan Rice. There has to be so many friendlies in there and so many competitive before you're blocked from changing nationality. So there's been a couple in football, and they have divided opinion. Now, in Declan Rice's case, he does have the grandparent rule on his side, but he also was born in this country. Kevin Kilban had the grandparent rule, was born in this country, but his parents were Irish, or one of his parents was Irish. And Diego Costa was residency, and he'd been in Spain for a lengthy period of time with Atletico Madrid. But he had played a minimum number of caps, or a maximum number of caps you can before you can swap allegiance with Brazil. Then you have to go back to the history days of Di Stefano at Real Madrid, who played for Argentina and Spain in the 50s. Then you are going back in time. It rarely happens in football. Rarely happens. But it's becoming a thing in football more common now, more common. And when you've got players like, for example, Wilfried Zaha, who can play for Democratic Republic of Congo or England, and he's chosen the nation of his parents, it does tell you all you need to know about the England setup. So yeah, we've lost out on players like Wilfried Zaha, amongst others. Do I rate Declan Rice? I think he's a very good midfielder who can play a multitude of roles in midfield. He's a very utilitarian midfielder. You can ask him to do an attacking midfielder. Predominantly, he's more defensive box-to-box midfielder, but he can fill in any midfield role you ask him to. But he's predominantly a central defensive midfielder, box-to-box type. Sort of similar to a Jordan Henderson, in my opinion. Sort of similar. But you need that type of player in your team in order for the team to have that solidity moving forward, and that stability, and that balance. Because teams that tend to fail either are not very good defensively, or they're too attack orientated, so their setup is unbalanced. You need a balanced setup for long term consistency and success, be it at league or international level. And that's, I think, where England went wrong in last summer, was their setup wasn't truly balanced. I looked at the squad selection, and the midfield depth just wasn't there. And that's where I have a lot of criticism for Gareth Southgate and his selections over a long period of time. Is there's not a lot of balance in his squad selections. The midfield was looking a bit thin. We left some good midfielders at home, like Ward-Prowse, for example, who I felt should have gone. Now, obviously, this World Cup is happening at a weird time of year. It's happening, obviously, in the middle of winter, and a lot can happen between now and November, December, later this year. Just 5-6 months away, but a lot can happen in that time frame. A hell of a lot can happen in 5 to 6 months. And with the whole Chelsea situation, a lot can happen in 5 to 6 weeks, which is the time frame Chelsea have to save themselves, is about 5 weeks, in order to get themselves new ownership and sort out their ownership problems. And now one of the potential buyers has been discounted. That leaves 2 bidders left on the table, and they're both American. So what does that mean for Chelsea going forward? We don't know. It just means more American ownership in English and European football, which I don't think fans, generally speaking, will enjoy. Chelsea fans don't care as long as the club has financial stability, which it's never had. It's a mirage that Chelsea have been financially stable for the last 18 years. They really haven't. If Chelsea had been financially stable, they wouldn't be 1.6 billion in debt to their former owner, who's bailed them out with multiple loans to keep them solvent. That is not a good business model. That says to me the club is not financially viable with how it's been run. Yes, they've had a lot of success, but at what cost? The win now mentality is finally caught up with Chelsea, and with the Rudiger, I think is definitely leaving in the summer. He's been signed up by another club. Christensen and Azpilicueta, they're technically free agents in the summer. Whether they sign with another club or what happens, that's nobody knows. So there's a lot of question marks between now and the World Cup. A lot of question marks. And the squad that takes the field in the Nations League games this summer, for example, will be different to the squad that takes the field in the opening games of the World Cup in November and December. It's going to be a lot can happen. You've got to see how the promoted sides from the Championship do, and obviously you've got to look at what happens to Everton, Leeds, and Burnley, because one of those 3 clubs is going down, and that will have a massive impact and bearing on international selection for England and other nations. So, whether Pickford has a get-out clause at Everton, which I highly doubt, he's got to play out his skin for the remaining, I think it's 3 or 4 games left this season. He's got to have 4 clean sheets. And I do remember going into the 2018 World Cup, his form wasn't great. And there were huge question marks on him being selected in the England setup going into the 2018 World Cup. I mean, obviously we got to a semi-final and we finished 4th overall, so it wasn't a bad tournament for England. We exceeded expectation. The performances may not have been the most free-flowing, but I think we did develop for the Euros, delayed Euros last year. But Jordan Pickford, there were question marks over Pickford going into 2018. There's still question marks now. He's got to be playing out his skin for the next 3 games. He has to play out his skin for the next couple of weeks in order, I think, to help Everton stay up. Because if he has, 2 or 3, let's have a look how many games remain. Actually, be an idea how many games are left to play. If he has a couple of bad games, Everton down. They cannot afford to lose any of their upcoming fixtures. They've got to win all their remaining games, and I just don't see that as likely. They can beat the occasional big club, like a Man United or a Chelsea, but the teams around them beat them, and that's the problem. Jesse Lingard is resigned to leaving Man United. He should have signed for West Ham. Some of the crap, you look at some of the stuff on social media aimed at him. He hasn't, I don't think, reached his full potential, but he showed what he could do when he was at West Ham. He definitely needs to be happy, I think. Right, let's have a look at scores and fixtures. There are 2 games left. There are 2 games left. Who have Everton got? Okay, Everton have 5 games remaining. They've got 1 Sunday, 1 Wednesday, 1 Sunday, 1 Thursday, 1 Sunday. So Everton are playing Leicester away. Their away form is atrocious. I can't see them winning that one on Sunday the 8th. On Wednesday the 11th, they have Watford away. It's proving crucial here. They've got 2 away games. Their away form, they've won once away since August. So even though Watford are done in the league and below them, I'm not sold on that one. They've got Brentford at home on the 15th, but Brentford are a far more competent outfit than Everton. And the form would suggest that. They know they're not going to win every game, but Brentford are going to be quite difficult. And Palace beat Everton like 4-5-1 in the FA Cup at Goodison. Palace will have no fear on the 19th against Everton. They've already destroyed them in the Cup this season. And Everton go away to Arsenal on the 22nd. I think it's tough. They got last year's FA Cup winners with Leicester away on Sunday. Then on the 11th next week, they've got Watford away, and Watford are fighting for every point they can get. While they're still not officially relegated, they're going to fight tooth and nail to stay up. Then they got Brentford, then they got Palace, both at home, and then Arsenal away. They need to win. They can beat Watford. I think they beat Arsenal, but they lose the other 4 games. It's just their away form isn't good enough. Their away form just is not good enough. And that's my personal opinion, is their away form isn't good enough. Man United have played more games though. They are 10 points clear of Watford, but they need to win everything, and they're in a fight, and they're not. They are in a situation where, other than Burnley and Leeds, there's an 8-point gap to the teams above them. It's a 20-point gap to the European places. Oh, dear. Traditionally speaking, about 34 points guarantees your safety. So it shows how difficult it is to avoid the drop, in reality, how competitive the league is. But Leeds and Burnley have both had really poor seasons as well. The teams above them are generally, we look at Newcastle, how they've turned things around since Eddie Howe took over. They were basically bottom with hardly any points. They are 10th now, they're top half table. They're still 40 points below Man City, mind. So the top 10 is more spaced out than the bottom half of the table. Newcastle are closer to Norwich than they are to Man City for points. But third through to 6th is a tight battle. But Man United have only got 2 games left. The other clubs have got 4 to 5 games left because they've got games in hand. Man United don't have those games in hand, which is why they won't get Champions League qualification at this point. And that is a disaster. While and their goal difference, West Ham have got a better goal difference, and they're below them in the table. The team directly above them, Tottenham, have got a 19 goal differential positive in goal difference. Well, a 15 goal differential in positive goal difference ahead of them. Man United's goal difference is atrocious. The only team in the top 8 with the worst goal difference is Wolves. And out of the teams with the positive goal difference, the only other team with the worst positive goal difference than is Palace, who sit in 12th. So that in itself is quite telling of where Man United are at. They've won 10 less games than Man City, 9 less than Liverpool. Um, Ironically, they've only won 3 less than Chelsea and Tottenham, but 4 less than Arsenal. So it really comes down to draws. They've lost more games, obviously, than City, Liverpool, Chelsea. But Arsenal, Tottenham, and West Ham have drawn more games. West Ham have a game in hand. And ironically, West Ham can actually overtake Man United. Weird that may seem, West Ham can, in theory, finish above Man United to the table. And they've got a game in hand. It's ridiculous. If West Ham win their last 3 games and Man United lose their last 2 games, West Ham finish above them by 2 points. Mad that. No, 3 points, sorry. And West Ham got a better goal difference, so it really gets interesting. Man United have had a very mediocre season. Unfortunately, the fan base got very, very used to the Alex Ferguson era and the amount of success post 92 to 2013. There was like 21-year period of almost trophies every season. But a lot of Man United and football fans in general forget that Ferguson was only sacked multiple times in his first 5 years in charge. It wasn't plain sailing. There were difficult times. Results weren't forthcoming. They weren't winning trophies. They weren't at the top of the table. They just adapted to the Premier League era better than some other clubs and had that sustained success. With the style of play that changed, the use of the transfer market effectively, those marquee signings, getting them settled into a side and making them effective. Has this season been a top 10 in the Premier League? I don't know. The top 2 are so far ahead of the rest. It has been overshadowed by the situation at Chelsea massively. That has overshadowed, I believe, the league is the Chelsea situation, and that raises a lot of questions again about who owns clubs, what say club owners have, the director's test or fit and proper person's test, as it's commonly known. That has to be in consideration for the direction the sport has taken. Definitely has to be looked at. Is it a top 10? I think it's been overshadowed. But I've been lucky enough to see every single Premier League season. Ironically, I follow the league less religiously now than what I did when I was younger. Again, I'm more into the internationals and the cup games, especially the FA Cup. I think more could be done to reach a wider audience. Again, that's to do with the TV rights. Would I say it's one of the top 10? I would say it has the. I think the current rival between Liverpool and Man City has the ability to make it grow the level of the product and increase the rivalry, and inspire a wider audience to be interested. How long Liverpool and Man City are the dominant two? That's anyone's guess, and especially with the new spending rules that UEFA will be implementing in a year or two's time. Big decisions are going to have to be made in regards to club spending and club finances, and we may see players, instead of leaving on big transfers, winding down their contracts and then leaving on frees to other clubs, in order for clubs to reduce their spending, or, as I say, Major League Soccer picking up a lot of talented players who are still in the prime of their careers, at a stage in earlier in a stage in their careers. Is it one of the top 10? Time will tell. Time will tell when people look back and go, oh, that was actually a pretty good season. Looking back on quality we've seen, I think the last couple of seasons, Liverpool, Man City have raised the bar to such a level now Um, I would say Liverpool, Man City are below the level they were at when they were breaking the 100-point barriers all the time. But those 3 seasons where records were tumbling, I think we are below that um, for a one-off season. However, they are so far ahead of the rest of the league. It's not even funny. Um, that's an argument for a salary cap and spending caps. That is a full argument is to compress the league and therefore make the league a bit more of a dogfight and a bit more of a contest. Is to bring in these spending rules, and therefore make every team have an equal opportunity to have a crack at success. I do think football needs some fresh faces winning silverware and having success. Um, or clubs that haven't had success for a long time getting their names on trophies for the first time in a lengthy period. I think that's only a good thing when you have multiple clubs having success rather than just a handful. That benefits the product you as a sport are trying to sell to the wider sporting fan base. There's a reason why football or soccer, as Dan would call it, hasn't had the same impact in North America that FIFA and the domestic leagues would have hoped over the last 30 years, 28 years since the World Cup in '94. It's taken longer. It's taken time, and it's partly to do with the play acting, the diving, the feigning of injury, the negative sportsmanship, the histrionics. People like Neymar actually harm and help the sport. Is a good way of looking at it. Which is why other sports have had more success in North America when trying to sell their product over what is known as the world's game, the global game. Of course, I don't think the FIFA corruption scandal has helped association football or soccer's image in North America. I think that's definitely damaged its image. Would I say North American sports leagues are more competitive? They have a salary cap system. Apart from baseball, they all have a salary cap system. And so, unless you're a really well-run team like the Tampa Bay Lightning are, and they push the limits of the salary cap, which they have to work within, in regards to the NHL, same with the Patriots and the NFL. They definitely allow more scope for the underdog to then have their period at the top. It definitely makes it harder to win and consistently win it. It does make it a more even playing field. It then depends on how the front office manage those teams. You can have a salary cap and then therefore a level playing field, but if you cannot manage your cap correctly, and if you can't manage your salary cap and your contracts effectively, which then hinders you establishing a competitive team. So if you have a couple of bad contracts on a team, and ask the Islanders about Rick DiPietro, or ask the Montreal Canadiens now with Carey Price, who said he would probably never play a full season ever again. There's your answer: is when you have those bad contracts that are immovable, you cannot shift them because no one is willing to take that salary cap hit onto their salary cap. Roster management and salary cap management are key, and some teams right now are in cap hell. The Tampa Bay Lightning, the Toronto Maple Leafs in the NHL. This is a league I follow a lot. It's the NHL. They're in a disaster when it comes to cap space and maneuverability with signing new players, extending players, signing free agents, trading for players. That means a team will have to be dismantled in order to stay cap compliant, whereas a team that's well below the cap but above the cap floor can pick up some good players on trade or free agency because another team can't extend them or they have to become cap compliant, and suddenly they're a good time. That's the issue with Major League Baseball with the luxury tax system. It actually punishes the smaller market teams or those teams with less money. I wouldn't say poorer owners, but less money, because the rich teams don't mind paying the fine and continuing. So those smaller market teams may only have a season or 2 or 3 seasons at the top of the Major League Baseball before they have to dismantle their roster. You don't think your dad will ever get into soccer because of the flopping reputation. We call it diving, although FIFA under their rulebook call it simulation. Um, simulation, it's brilliant. I thought simulation was, when you have a computer program and you're simulating a possible outcome of several events. We use the AI in a computer game to simulate an outcome rather than actually doing the action yourself in game. FIFA simulation. It is a bookable offence. It's rarely pulled up. Referees tend to avoid booking players who dive or fake injury or play act. It's in the rule book. It should be properly enforced. The embellishment is the term ice hockey uses. Embellishing an injury. In ice hockey, if you're caught embellishing, you sit for 2 minutes in the penalty box. Um, you know, association football or soccer has it in the rule book that it is a bookable offence. Unfortunately, not enough referees are willing to book the player for play acting. So therefore, players continue to get away with it because they know the referees aren't going to pull them up on it, and they can win a free kick for their side. That to me is sending out the wrong message that you're coaching players to fake. You're coaching players to pretend they're injured. You're coaching players to basically cheat to gain an advantage. And it's even with the VAR, they barely pull up players for diving. If a goal has been disallowed or something has happened where the player's clearly been found to have dived, book him or her. Book the player. Thankfully, in the women's game, which we'll see obviously next month with the women's, is it World Cup or Euros? Is it World Cup or Euros? It's Euros. Hopefully, next month with the women's Euros, we don't see a lot of diving. That's my hope. And we generally don't in women's football as a rule. But the same thing applies. If the player dives, flops, embellishes, they need to be booked. They need to be punished by the officials. The officials, for whatever reason, choose not to. Either they're afraid to, or for whatever reason, they choose not to punish players for blatant cheating. Um, um, and yeah, basketball players do it as well. Again, another reason why I can't get into basketball is it's the score lines are too ridiculous in basketball. It's too easy to rack up a score line against a team in basketball. I'm not saying it's a bad sport. It's just not a sport I follow or enjoy watching. That's no slight against the people who support, watch, play, are employed by basketball leagues. There's no slight on them. It's just not one of those sports I enjoy. It's kind of obvious the sports I enjoy, there has to be some physical contact. It has to be a physical game. Um, you know, it's basketball is meant to be a non-contact sport or a semi-contact sport's the term. I never enjoyed playing it at school. I can casually watch it, but I can't get invested. And in regards to hardly anyone over here is paying attention to the NBA playoffs right now. Not a great. I wasn't aware that it wasn't getting the attention. Now, why that is? Could it be that the area of New York you're in doesn't have that catchment area? Because mid-state New York, historically, does it root for an NBA team? Obviously, there's a big student population in Albany, and I think every city in New York that has a university campus, there will be basketball programs on the NCAA. Are they more interested in the NHL playoffs? Are they more interested in, what's happened at the NFL draft? Major League Baseball finally getting its season started, admittedly delayed because of the lockout. The fact is this a normal trend for New York State outside of metropolitan New York not to be interested in the NBA playoffs? Because I don't know what sports fans outside of New York City and the catchment area of New York, metropolitan wise, would feel about professional sports in like places like Albany and Buffalo, other than the Bills and the Sabres. To me, it's straight over my head. I know there's NCAA programs in the universities. I know, obviously, there's grassroots community. Like you've got beer league hockey, and you've got you know your rec league baseball, and you've got your grassroots community based leagues and sports in place. Now, could this NBA playoffs sort of disinterest be down to the aftermath of COVID? The Is the league doing something wrong with whatever it may be? Is it not branding itself correctly? Because from what I can tell, um, obviously I'm a big fan of the NRL, and I have my NRL subscription, which is through their league website. So when I'm actually watching a live feed on a weekend, I wake up really early and I watch a live feed. There will be adverts for the NBA playoffs. So it's been really well advertised in Australia. I know here we have obviously one of our major broadcasters in Sky, which is the equivalent to what was Fox, which is now Bailey Sports in the US, has a broadcast agreement, and it's shown on Sky, and you know you get to see it, imprinted in regards to adverts, be it online or on TV, Sky package, NBA playoffs, bang. I don't think upstate New York has a passion for basketball per se, and passion goes towards the Syracuse Orange. I'm assuming that's university. That is interesting. Very interesting. Last year at the bar I worked at, hardly anyone showed out for the playoffs. Yet the Euros were the most packed days we saw during the summer. I think that's partly a legacy of COVID, partly, and the cost of living that's obviously hitting people, especially in lower income areas, like mid-state New York. The incomes are generally lower than in metropolitan New York, or even in Buffalo, because it's a border crossing city, so incomes are generally lower. But online, the NBA playoffs isn't. When I look at social media, and I'm on multiple sports pages on Facebook and on Instagram, and I've got mates who watch all the various major leagues in the US and leagues in Europe, and it's not getting a lot of interest on social media. Has the NBA reached its peak? Has the product run out of steam a little bit? Because I'm not seeing a lot of in-your-face advertising for it. I know that in Australia the NBA is a very popular league for fans to watch as an overseas league. I know here in the UK there is a broadcast arrangement with Sky Sports, which was sister network to Fox Sports in the US, which is now Bailey Sports, with the breakup of the old Murdoch media empire and bits getting sold off and rebranded. The fact that the NFL draft and the NHL playoffs are getting more attention on social media globally, not just locally in New York or regionally in Europe, tells you something. That is very striking that other sports, be it in their off season or in their postseason matches, are getting that more traction and that much more interest and discussion. That is very, very telling. The fact that a sport that is not a traditional sport for the US and Canada last year, sports bars in the area were sold out. I think it's a demographic and a geographical demographic. I mean, I don't know how long you've been in mid-state New York as a student. I'm assuming you haven't been there your entire life. I don't know what part of the US you're originally from. Your family's originally from. Maybe you are from Albany and you decide to go to your local university to do your course, which is, I think, the best way to be as a student, is to stay still close to your hometown, but far enough away to get up to mischief. No, I'm 32, and I've met fans of almost every professional sport you can think of. I've met a lot of people through my work and through education. I've met a lot of people from all around the world, again, the NBA is one of those professional sports that I've met the fewest fans of. I've met more baseball fans than NBA fans. That tells you something. And baseball is not overly popular over in Europe as a general rule of thumb. It's not as popular as basketball. But I've met more Major League Baseball fans than NBA fans um, over here. Now, it's been over, what, 12, 13 years since I've been on intercontinental Europe on holiday. So I can't comment on continental Europe and and what European-based fans would feel. But if you go by overall, as a continent-wide, ice hockey is the second most popular sport for participation and fandom and TV deal. So, okay, so you are actually, still Syracuse isn't that far from Albany, so you're still sort of in the same geographical area um, of New York State. I've got to see where Syracuse is in relation to Albany. I've got to remember. Uh, but you're still in central New York State, so that. Let's have a look. I know Syracuse is a major sporting city for where are oh, it's not too far from Albany. It's far, but it's not too far. So that's by the lakes. Um, and Albany is, it's not overly far. It's far enough. It's a couple of hours, but it's not stupidly far. But no, Syracuse is a known college college city, and Albany is as well, actually. Um, and you've stayed in the same area of New York State, central New York State. But yeah, again, certain certain sports have a better global reach and sell themselves better to an international fan base. But I know no one discussing the NBA playoffs right now. It's never really been a big discussion point about around my friendship group because it's normally the NHL playoffs which get discussed with my friendship group and the NHL. Major League Baseball doesn't really, in my view, have an impact. I know they did the London series in 2019, and I have discussed that. I have. They are planning to come back next year. Whether they actually do or not is another thing. 3 hour drive. That's the equivalent from here to see my nan, my grandmother, and my uncle down in Dorset. That's a fair lick. Um, fair lick. I'll give you that. I will give you that. That's a fair distance. But it's 3 hours is not that bad. It's like from here to Manchester in England. It's not that bad. That's not a bad one-way journey time. The problem is with the US over European countries is the lack of public transportation. Um, but that's another topic entirely. Um, and the public infrastructure for transportation from intercity transportation that isn't reliant on commercial airliners. But that's another topic for another day. Basically, the US hasn't really invested in its passenger railway network very well. Amtrak is all you really have outside of various metro systems and community transit systems. They don't really have. Amtrak doesn't go to every single state and every single major city in every single state. So public Oh no, the state of New York is quite big. It's the size of some European countries. A lot of states in the US are the size of countries. It's ridiculous. Um, but it is what it is. I mean, the fact the NBA isn't getting that playoff recognition and people aren't watching in the local sports bars where you work and the area you currently live in. Whether you go back to living in Albany or not is another thing. The fact that a sport that is a non-traditional sport in the US had higher viewership figures when it's not even a World Cup tells you all you need to know about is the NBA as a product needing a refresher? Does it need a rebrand? Do they need to look at why it's not having the reach it could be having? Is it too reliant on a handful of superstar players being the ones selling the product? All those kind of questions need to be thought about in great detail. I had to think on that one. I just heard my neighbours outside and they were a bit distracting. Um, that's something that leagues will look at, especially when they're trying to grow their brands internationally or globally to an overseas market. Now, the NBA is very good um, um, with selling itself overseas. I saw somewhere that the five boroughs of New York is more than double the size of Greater London. I know the population of metropolitan New York is bigger than the population of Greater London. I wouldn't say so. Um, uh, Size of New York City compared to London. Let's have a look. The UK capital city, which is comparable in population, so similar population. We have a bigger population. Yeah, no, London is 607 square miles. New York City, that's the five boroughs, is 302.6 square miles. So we're double the size. And the five boroughs counts as New York. We're double the size for the same population. So um, the population per square kilometre or per square mile is higher in New York, but we have more space. Um, yeah, no, the NBA is way too reliant on a handful of individual players trying to sell the product rather than the quality level of the product being high across all the teams in the league, where on any given night, any team can beat anyone regularly. And it's always the same teams that regularly make playoffs. Um, and unfortunately, you haven't got like the Chicago Bulls era with Michael Jordan, and everyone knows who Michael Jordan is. Um, you just don't have that connection with a team because it wasn't just Michael Jordan on that Chicago's Bulls team. It was multiple, um, multiple figures at the time in the league, not just the Chicago Bulls, but multiple teams. You just don't have that. I'm not feeling a connection where I can go. I could name apart from Curry and LeBron. There's not a lot of players that I can go are global household names. They might be national household names in the US and Canada, but not global. Yes, the Chicago Bulls brand is still massive. The team is obviously not as successful as it once was, but the brand is still massive. Yeah, I don't know many current NBA players, but as I say, I'm not a massive fan of basketball. That's not to say it's a bad sport or it's not entertaining for those who do watch it and enjoy it. Absolutely, but I do think the NBA has lost its way. It's put too many eggs in one basket with a few superstar global brands to sell the product. Um, and it's too reliant on a handful of superstar players or brands to sell itself, whereas the product should be the thing selling itself. That's where the NHL is so good. The product sells itself. Then you put the skill level the players have on top of that, and there's your answer to your problem. You need a few franchise faces, but in reality, the product sells itself. So the NHL had a problem in the 90s with the dead puck era where it was too defensive and and the star players didn't have the space. The goal scoring gone through the roof. Look at what the Florida Panthers have done this year with their goal scoring. It's record-breaking, ridiculous in a regular season. Regardless of that, the NHL, the product sells itself, then you add the superstars on top, whereas the NBA, the superstars have to sell the product before you add the product on top, which is not comparable. And while it's very popular at NCAA level, collegiate level, it's not on the same level as the NHL. It only has the one minor league affiliate system to develop players after college, where the NHL has two affiliates, plus there are other professional leagues in North America and Europe where players can play and develop their skill set. So there's already that greater player base and talent pool to choose from, where players, if they're not quite NHL ready or recovering from a severe injury, can get game time and develop and reach their potential. Now, not every ice hockey player is going to play in the NHL. They know this. But at the same time, you've got a higher chance of going through the juniors and the collegiate system or developing in Europe and playing in the NHL or even the AHL than in the NBA or its minor league equivalent. Because there are more professional leagues, there's more pathways, and more countries play the sport professionally at a decent level than basketball. Oh dear, this cold is really doing my nut. But there you go. The fact that the NBA is struggling to get attention in the playoffs, especially in a city like Syracuse, that is a sports mad location because of its university NCAA programs that it has in place, tells you all you need to know about the NBA's product right now. It'll be interesting to see what, at the end of this playoffs, what the actual viewership figures on TV were like. Whether they were higher or lower than pre-COVID, basically, for percentage of audience retention, and then you can compare that to the NHL playoffs as well. But what the viewership figures were like pre-COVID to this year, because I think that has had an impact. There's no doubt. In regards to adding in the cost of living crisis, certain areas of a New York State, for example, there's not a universal minimum salary. It does vary. So if you are in a lower salaried area where salaries are lower than, let's say, New York or Albany, and you're in a rural location, small town America, and therefore your average salary is going to be on the lower end of things, you're going to feel the pinch. You're going to be watching less sport. You're going to be, cutting back on your spending to the necessities. It's just a matter of fact of life. But we'll see what the viewership figures are like, because I can't see that being a US-wide drop-off in discussion and in fandom. I just cannot see that being a thing. Not true. When you've got a handful of teams dominating constantly, that doesn't necessarily help. But the 80s, you only had 4 teams win the Stanley Cup in the 80s, and 3 of them were 2 of them were dynasties. Then you had the Canadians and the Flames in there, but you had the Oilers and the Islanders, and there were only 4 teams that won the Stanley Cup between 80 and 90. But other teams made the final in that period. But when you have, the Lakers, the Cavaliers, and the Golden State Warriors, yeah, that does put people off when you have a salary cap system in place to make the league more competitive, yet the same teams somehow end up winning all the time. It does put people off the product when you're going, well, the system is clearly broken. Yeah, the BLM movement, well, I understand. I'm going to say this, and I'm going to be as little political as possible. I I'm all in favour, and I'm going to say this, on minority rights, regardless of who the minority is, and equality for everyone. There are better ways to do it. Sport should not be political. But unfortunately, it has been politicised in such a way that it's become more divisive than the issue that is being discussed. Now, in my opinion, obviously leagues like the NBA and the NFL have a higher African American or Afro Caribbean player base than the NHL, for example. So it is more noticeable when players are obviously impacted by poor race relations with the police, and obviously the issues with education, medication, getting insurance, getting a loan for a house, banking, you name it. There's a lot of hurdles, especially in the US, that an African American or an Afro Caribbean, so that would be like a Jamaican immigrant, for example, or a Bahamian immigrant would have to face. Um, so I can understand why the NBA decided to allow the Black Lives Matter message to be there. However, what we've now found out about the BLM movement with its Marxist overtones and the founders becoming exceptionally wealthy by stealing donations from quite honest people from all backgrounds donating to it. Um, there you go. Yeah, sport should be an escape. It should be. However, in our sporting principles, sport and politics on a professional sporting level outside the Olympics should be separate. I do agree on that. We do watch sports and involve ourselves in sports because it is an escape from our humdrum everyday lives. um, yes, they absolutely, definitely got things wrong. As the saying goes, "Go woke, go broke." Look, Elon Musk buying Twitter has sent woke liberal narcissists into meltdown, because that's generally what do-gooders are. Is they're not actually doing any good; they're just self-inflating their ego, and they can't take criticism, obviously. But I do agree with highlighting the issues with inequality, be it for race or socioeconomic status or religion or sexuality. I do believe in highlighting and fighting those inequalities. There are ways of doing it, and there are better ways of doing it. But we are where we are. We'll see what happens. But there's the Qatar World Cup and the constant, why are we going there? We should boycott. It's like, well, we're too far down the track because of all the contractual arrangements that are in place. There'd be a load of lawsuits if every country was to go, we're not going. So we are going to the Qatar World Cup, whether we as fans want to or not. We don't have to go. We can choose to go, but our nations that we follow are going. In regards to the NBA, it's one of those leagues where there is a lot of ego involved because the squad sizes are small. So you're going to have some big dominating egos. And just watch The Last Dance about Michael Jordan and the Chicago Bulls. It's a very toxic environment in that dressing room. For the entire period, they're winning, and when they are losing, it's very, by today's standards, there's going to be people up for bullying charges, harassment, racism, you name it. By today's standards, you wouldn't be able to get away with that. You wouldn't be able to do that documentary or fly on the wall document, because I know a lot of teams are doing this fly on the wall documentary where they invite the Sunderland Till I Die. If a team was to show in that locker room that kind of toxic element, the winner all costs element, which I honestly do believe is the undoing of every single sports team eventually. Um, the amount of people that would basically, that I'm surprised that they were as successful as they were. And I was reading what was I reading? Jordan B. Peterson comment, a quote about strong men and weak men. Depends how you interpret that quote. But I'll say this: evil happens when good men do nothing. There's your weak man. If you are a strong in your convictions, you don't allow shit to take place. Basically. If you're weak in your convictions, you're not a strong man. You're a coward. So what you see in The Last Dance about the Chicago Bulls is one of the most toxic environments you will ever see. Not just in a sporting context, but in any context. It's not healthy. Um, oh God, yes. A lot of people don't realise the abuse of performance enhancing drugs, be it therapeutic use exemptions or otherwise. It was rampant, much like Major League Baseball. Um, much like Major League Baseball. I mean, the NHL had its cocaine issues and amphetamine and alcohol issues, so not performance enhancing. And the NFL has always had that lingering um, steroid misuse and generally, actually, ironically, homophobic attitudes towards players, which has led to a lot of players, self harming and suicide. Um, and a sort of an attitude to player welfare that's still, even with the CTE lawsuit, that they're still trying to avoid paying money to as many players as possible by finding ways to give them the absolute minimum in payout. Oh, look, I mean, the NBA as a league, you had the Tim Donaghy refereeing gambling scandal, and I've done videos on that. I've looked into that. The NBA, however, has been overshadowed in scandal by the other major leagues having. But we've got so used to scandal in North American sports that we're just. I mean, there's a website which can tell you, especially with the NFL and the NBA, what players are currently arrested or under investigation for what offence. There's actually websites dedicated to telling you what NBA and NFL players are currently on court charges in county jails and have citations. Um, and that, and we as sports fans have become so used to, so numb to it that when a player in the NFL or the NBA gets arrested for drink driving or assault and battery or drugs possession, we're like, okay, fair enough. But when a player in any other sport, be it in North America or around the world, gets arrested for anything, it makes more news headlines. But I think rugby league is going the same way, where they're becoming very indifferent to another off season, another scandal. With the NRL, it happens almost every year. Another off season, another scandal. Players getting arrested, getting charged. Football, soccer, constantly has negative headlines about players misbehaving, and that there are players who are facing and are going through legal issues right now. Be it Mason Greenwood here in the UK. There's some players in Spain. There's some players in France having their legal issues. And depending on what jurisdiction you live in, they're quite high profile. Your baseball coach breeds quite a toxic environment. He would call it competitive. There's give and take to it as a player. It can be very tough to play for at times. I've always found, looking at it as a fan and as a player, that the best coaches are the ones who can motivate and manage you by sometimes going, "You're shit, you need to improve," to those going, "You know what, you put 110% today and you lost, but it doesn't bother me. You put the effort in, fair play. You've done what you were told. You executed the game plan to what I told you. You did your job. Well done." There's got to be a bit of almost like an uncle or a father figure in a sense. You've got to discipline your players and say, "Look, here's the discipline. You've got to stay disciplined. You've got to work through the systems we put in place." At the same time, You've got to have that kind of uncle father kind of vibe where you're seeing a player struggling for whatever reason. You've got to find out what's going on, why, and work out a solution that has a positive outcome for both player and team. Um, Now, 20 years ago, that would probably be seen as perfect coaching technique, what your coach is doing. Now, I don't know exactly why it's toxic or why it's difficult, draining. But having that, that shout, that blow up, that shouting, screaming competition where you just, you know, give them a spray, as the term is, and you just give them the teacup treatment, which is, smashing up the dressing room and screaming and shouting. You only have so many blow ups like that before the players will just stop listening. Um, and there are ways to mitigate. Okay, you know a positive environment is a winning environment. Um, you can have a stern but fair coach who will expect the highest standards, but know he's going to get the highest standards because there's respect, because respect is earned. If the players start seeing that the tactics employed by the coach are working, they're going to respect his methods. Um, when you have players fearful of making mistakes and fearful of underperforming on a day, whether they're not fully fit or they've got some personal issues that are affecting them, that's when you have a negative culture that has a negative impact on the direction the team is taking. Um, and the rest is history. I think there was a 99% chance the Ewing draft was fixed. Stern digs around so much of that envelope. The second he feels that fold, he pulled it, and bang, it's the Knicks. What are the odds? Um, there has been a lot of debate about the Ewing draft and the Jordan draft and where they go and who picks them up and such. But the NBA at the time, there was a lot of problems surrounding the NBA, and the NBA would rather you didn't remember the negatives surrounding the league um, at the time. A lot of my teammates just tune him out right when he starts yelling. I bet it wasn't that way. Actually, it really was. Generally, you will notice with teams when players have tuned out the coach and when the coach has lost the dressing room. And if your teammates are tuning out um, when he's berating you, he's lost the dressing room a long time ago. He's lost the respect of the players. He's probably lost the respect of a lot of his coaching staff. And this has always been the case. You talk to any ex-player of any sport, and they will always say the best coaches with the best man managers, who not only were brilliant tacticians, but they could have a shouting match. They could have that spray in them, as they say. Could have that outburst. But for the most part, that rarely happened because they would have to be seriously annoyed with what was going wrong on that day, being outperformed or not, But they would generally also be pretty good at man managing. So if a player was, having some issues at home or new to the team, not settling in, find out how to make things. Um, there will come a point where players will just stop listening. They'll deliberately play badly in training games. They'll deliberately train badly. They'll play badly on the field, and that's their way of protesting. That's the only way you can protest. Um, but you'll be surprised. Even 20 years ago, that the best the best coaches, ironically, aren't the ones who shout, and scream a lot. They might have a good war speech in them, but shouting, and screaming generally happens when, even with the best coaches, when it's gone horribly wrong that day and they are frustrated with the energy levels of performance being put in. When they're doing it almost on a daily basis, every game, they're losing the dressing room. Very few coaches have that kind of ability where they can have a blow up like that and still retain the dressing room on a long term basis. A lot of those type of coaches are more short impact, short time frame coaches, where um, there is a need to improve results in the short term and shaking things up, like a John Tortorella, for example. Um, more of a short impact coach. Um, and results will improve, and then he'll move on to another team. Results will improve, whatever. Um, but they have a short shelf life. They won't be a long time coach at a team. So, have you seen the movie Miracle? Yes, I've seen Miracle on Ice. Herb Brooks. I've seen Miracle. I've seen the film about the 1980 um, Olympic winning team. I last watched that film quite some time ago. I mean, I'm 32 now. I have last watched Miracle when I was about 18, 19. I first watched it when I was quite young as well. Um, I don't honestly remember a lot of the film. It's not one of those films that leaves a lasting impression on me. Um, but there's been a lot written about and a lot said about his coaching techniques during the build up to and that Olympic run that they were on. A lot has been spoken about from the players who played for him, players who played against his teams, and obviously, his assistants and the American system and the administrators. There's been a lot mentioned about some of his quirky coaching techniques. Um, I think a comparable for being quirky would be Brian Clough in football, Nottingham Forest and Derby County, amongst other teams, and Brighton would be Brian Clough. Would be a comparable to Herb Brooks for being different. The knowledge of the game, the fact that he was willing to think outside the box. It would be interesting to see how it be. As I say, much has been said. I don't have a lot of comment on his coaching style. Obviously, he was coaching before my time. The sport has massively evolved since the 1980 Olympics to where it is now. His coaching techniques probably wouldn't work today, or they might be even more successful today. You just don't know. But a lot has happened in the preceding 42 years since the 1980 Olympics. A lot has happened. The sport has massively changed from what it was back then. Obviously, back then, the Olympics, you had to be amateur, not professional players. So the quality of players he was dealing with were different to the players that an Olympic coach now would have to deal with, who are professional, regardless if they're NHL or otherwise, AHL, European leagues, KHL, that kind of thing. Which talented, high-profile athlete has shown the least amount of passion for their given sport? That's got to be Pogba for me. Paul Pogba in recent years is not shown enough commitment. There is no doubt that Paul Pogba is exceptionally skillful and exceptionally talented, but where's the passion? Where's the commitment? Where's the energy levels? It's just not there, and it's noticeable with the amount of money he's on per week, or his annual salary being quite a substantial chunk of change. Paul Pogba has got to be one of the most frustrating players. Even Mario Balotelli shows passion and bit of fire in his belly, because Balotelli is quite a divisive figure, but Pogba is just a head scratcher where his head's at. And I do think that has a knock-on impact on the players around him. People go, Harry Maguire is useless. He's having a poor season, but you can see he's emotionally feeling his poor season. You can see he's frustrated. You can see the anguish on his face. Pogba just doesn't show anything. There's no emotion there. And he's off contract in the summer. Whether he stays at United or they let him go is going to be very interesting. So I would say Paul Pogba in association football is definitely a player who shows very little passion, and he is very talented and he is very high profile. But he's lacking that emotional commitment, and he's lacking that emotional investment. There's no doubt that he is very talented, very, very talented. Absolutely no doubt. Unfortunately, he's not committed enough, and he tunes out far too often. He's too lately. That's my personal opinion. He's so frustrating to watch because you know he can be absolutely brilliant, but at the same time you know he's going to be absolutely frustrating. Yeah, no, his parents are massive Marseille fans, and Marseille is the biggest club in France for fan base. Look, he's going to be available for nothing if the right club can come along and motivate him. The right team can come along. Um, Anything's possible if they can get him motivated and focused week in week out, and get him consistent, passionate. Anything's possible. But I think he's having a negative impact on his teammates. Owen Farrell, no, Owen Farrell has passion. Owen Farrell definitely has passion. Um, uh, I've been watching Owen Farrell now for a long time. In the England setup, there's definitely passion there with Owen Farrell. Aubameyang at Arsenal, Lacazette, I think, has got less passion than Aubameyang. Um, but a lot of Arsenal players aren't fully committed to what they're doing, and that's been the case for many, many years, long before Arteta and Emery were in the hot seat. We're talking to the Wenger era. There are a lot of players who were just there, bodies on the field. Um, and I do think that has ultimately impacted the direction of the team. Um, but again, obviously, I'm not going to say the players are lacking passion. They just seem they lack passion. Um, and their head's not in the right place. Now, Arsenal were a declining side. They've started to pick up again with those 3 FA Cups in recent years, but they were a declining side for quite some time, to be honest. No, Owen Farrell, I think, does show it. I think when he puts in a suspect hit, or um, he does like a bit of chirping. You can tell when Owen Farrell's on his game, because he actually generally is quiet and calm. When he's off his game, he's getting involved in the stupidity. So when he shows his passion, he's under pressure. Ironically, that's the irony behind that. Um, but when he's on his game, he tones that down. He's more focused. But when he's off his game, that's where the passion boils up, the emotion boils up, and then um, you see him get yellow carded, sin binned, penalties given away, England on the back foot. That's how you can tell Owen Farrell is you know tuned in. Is um, is to do with uh, how um, how he controls his emotion. So when he gets the emotions get better of him, he's under pressure and England are on the back foot. When he controls it, they're on the front foot and they're playing well. That's the interesting thing with Owen Farrell. When he gets too passionate and too invested in the game, his team, be it Saracens or England, is generally having a bad day. When he's more controlled and composed, and he isn't getting riled up, and he's not getting involved with the sledging, and he's actually calmer, his team is having a good day. Um, but no, Pogba is just not there at all. Um, I would say Pogba is the best example of a player who, if he is passionate, doesn't show it, and his performances don't show it either. Because he's so inconsistent, it's unreal. How has he become a World Cup winner? How has he, made a final of the Euros? How has he won a Europa League? I know it's not the main European trophy, but how has he managed to be part of a team and a crucial part of a team that's won a Europa League a few years back? I mean, how has he been playing at the top level when he's so vacant and he's so detached and inconsistent? He's stealing a living because he's not consistent enough. Imagine if Pogba was consistent and showcased his ability week in, week out to the best of his ability. He'll be unplayable. The opposition teams wouldn't get near him. He'll be undroppable for the side he's playing for, and he would be unplayable to play against. Um, Honestly, on his day, he does have that ability with his game. No doubt on his day. He does have that ability, but he's so inconsistent, it's frustrating. I think one of his best games he had was the 2018 FA Cup semi-final against Tottenham. They're 1-0 down, and he's instrumental in that second half in getting them over the line. Admittedly, they play the worst FA Cup final in history against Chelsea, but instrumental in getting the team over the line. The Europa League final in 2017? I think it was 2017. Might have been 2016. Was it 2018? I think it was 2018. The Europa League final where United win. He's one of the best players on the field against Ajax. So he's proven he can do it at club level. He's proven he can do it at international level as well when he wants to, not when he needs to. And that's the difference, is wanting to go, I want to play good today. I feel that I'm in the mood today. I'll put some effort into it. Or, being motivated. I've got to give 110% every week. Even if I'm not playing my best, I've got to contribute to the team. I've got to have energy for the team. I've got to organise. I've got to, if it's not going well, if I can't find my pass, be more defensively minded. Be more tactically aware. He just doesn't have that all-round consistency, and it is an enigma because people have compared him to Vieira. And Vieira was a world-class player. People have compared him to Zidane. But I don't think he even matches Emmanuel Petit or David Ginola. So those French players of the 90s and the early 2000s who he's been compared to, he doesn't compare to. Because the difference is Deschamps, Petit, Zidane, Vieira, Ginola. And there were other French players as well, like Lizarazu, who was more of a wing-back but could play midfield, Djokayev. They were more consistent and showed more passion. And when they were having a bad game in attack, they were still part of the defensive setup, worked within the framework of whatever system they were playing. He just doesn't have that correct mentality. And of course, he would have grown up watching these guys play at their peak in the late 90s, early 2000s, when the French team then was what the French team is now, one of the best teams in the world. And he doesn't even compare to what these guys are capable of. He doesn't even compare to what Zidane did in the game, Petit did in the game. Ginola, the best player never to win the Premier League, in my opinion. One of the best runners with the ball and one of the most passionate players I've ever seen. Deschamps, the first manager to win a World Cup, as well as being a player to win the World Cup. He is the first player and then manager to win the World Cup. Not the most skillful, but the most hard-working. So far, the only French club captain to lift the Champions League. Bring that one out there with Marseille. These players encapsulate what it means to play not only for France, but at top clubs around Europe, in top leagues around Europe. You have to see what they did in the game at club and international level. Some of the highlight reel goals they scored or created. Some of their best games were played in European competition or cup competition of some kind. They've won league titles, David Ginola notwithstanding in that one. Although I think David Ginola did win some cup trophies. I'll have to double check David Ginola. Because David Ginola did not play his entire career in England. He did play a lengthy spell in, I believe, France. So David Ginola, Robert Pires. When Pogba is being compared to some of these players, he doesn't even come close. He's not even fit to lace their boots. And yeah, he's a lot of people say he's lazy. He's lazy. And rightly so, in my opinion, rightly so. He's rightly criticised as being lazy, underperforming, not. He doesn't quite, in my opinion, reach the high standards that is expected of him. And yes, he's good in games or in spells in games, but it's not consistent. It's not there. And then you have to question what impact that has on the teams he plays in. could look at the Euros with France; they weren't great. Look at Man United over recent seasons; there has been that accusation that his personality is impacting the team. But anyway, I'm going to leave that there. Thank you very much for your questions and the topics we've discussed. Been very, very interesting. Really appreciate it. I'm going to sort some dinner out, and try and. Oh, this cold is really winding me up. That's better. I can breathe again now. And I'm going to sort some dinner out. But thank you very much for watching, all your questions. Really appreciate the topics we've discussed. Of course, Man City play Real Madrid tonight. What's the outcome of that? Man City go in with a 4-3 advantage. Will it be an all-English final? What will happen in said final? Man City get to win the Champions League. It's going to be very, very interesting. But yeah, thank you very much for watching all your questions, and I'll have some more videos for you very, very soon.